Whispers from the Eternal Sands. In the vast stillness of an Egyptian tomb, time stands suspended. The air, undisturbed for millennia, carries molecules that once brushed against the lips of priests murmuring ancient prayers. Here, in chambers sealed against the relentless desert winds, lies humanity's most ambitious defiance against death itself, the mummified remains of those who refuse to surrender to oblivion. The practice of mummification represents far more than a mere technical achievement. It embodies the profound Egyptian understanding that death is not an ending, but a threshold, a doorway to an existence that might span eternity if only the body could be preserved as a vessel for the returning soul. What seems macabre to modern sensibilities was, to the ancient Egyptians, the most sacred expression of hope. Imagine, if you will, the body of a recently deceased pharaoh, laid out on a purification table of alabaster. Around him move silent figures in white linen, their faces partially covered, their movements deliberate and reverent. The scent of frankincense and myrrh fills the chamber as they begin a process that will take 70 days to complete. A process developed over centuries, perfected through careful observation, and elevated to an art form unmatched in human history. The story of Egyptian mummification is not merely a catalog of techniques, the hooks and salts, the resins and wrappings, though these details fascinate us. It is equally a journey into the Egyptian mind, where the border between life and death was understood differently than in our modern world. To comprehend mummification is to grasp a civilization's relationship with mortality, its conception of the soul, and its unwavering belief in continuation. This ancient art reached its zenith during the New Kingdom period, when embalmers achieved such mastery that bodies preserved under their care remain recognizable today, more than 3,000 years later. The face of Pharaoh Seti I, who ruled Egypt until 1279 BCE, still bears his distinctive features, his expression one of serene dignity, a triumph of preservation that modern science, with all its advancements, can only marvel at. Yet mummification was never solely about physical preservation. Each step in the process was accompanied by ritual, by sacred words and gestures that ensured the deceased's spiritual journey would proceed unhindered. The physical techniques served the metaphysical purpose. The embalmers were not merely craftsmen, but facilitators of transcendence. As we explore this gentle art of defying decay, we will witness a civilization's most intimate confrontation with mortality. We will follow the deceased from the moment of death, through the meticulous preparation of the body, to the final placement in a tomb designed to serve as an eternal dwelling. Along this journey, we will encounter not only the technical ingenuity of the ancient Egyptians, but also their profound wisdom about life's greatest mystery. The sands of Egypt have yielded many secrets, but perhaps none as compelling as this: that in their careful preservation of the dead, the Egyptians revealed everything about how they valued life. Chapter 1. The eternal journey begins beyond the threshold of death. The setting sun cast long shadows across the western bank of the Nile, painting the limestone cliffs in hues of amber and gold. For the ancient Egyptians, this daily spectacle was more than a mere astronomical event. It was a profound metaphor for the human experience of death and rebirth. As Ra, the sun god, descended into the underworld each evening only to emerge triumphant at dawn, so too did they believe the human soul could transcend death's apparent finality. "I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow," proclaims the Book of the Dead, that collection of spells and incantations meant to guide the deceased through the perilous journey beyond life. This single line encapsulates the Egyptian conception of existence, a continuous flow rather than a finite span. Death was not an ending but a transition, not oblivion but transformation. To understand mummification, one must first grasp this fundamental perspective. The Egyptians did not preserve bodies out of fear or denial of death. Rather, they did so from a profound acceptance of death's place in a larger cosmic order, combined with an unshakable belief in what lay beyond it. The Egyptian soul, a complex constellation. Unlike the simpler Western concept of a single soul, the Egyptians perceived the human essence as a sophisticated constellation of elements. Each person possessed a chi, a vital force received at birth that required sustenance even after death. They also had a ba, often depicted as a human-headed bird that could travel between the worlds of the living and the dead. The ak represented the transformed, enlightened spirit that could join the circumpolar stars. Finally, there was the ren, the name, and the shut, the shadow, each an essential aspect of personhood. Most crucially, these elements needed a focal point, a physical anchor in the world of matter. This was the preserved body, the khat, without which the soul's components would scatter, leaving the deceased truly dead in every sense. As one funerary text warns, "May your flesh not creep, may your limbs not perish, may your body not be destroyed, may you not be turned away from your body." The stakes could not have been higher. Without proper preservation, the individual faced not merely physical dissolution, but cosmic annihilation. A second, far more terrible death from which there could be no return. The weight of eternity. Imagine for a moment the psychological burden of such beliefs. Every Egyptian, from the humblest farmer to the divine pharaoh, lived with the knowledge that their actions in this life would echo through eternity. The heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and justice. Only those whose hearts were light with virtue could proceed to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. This accountability to eternity shaped every aspect of Egyptian civilization. Their monumental architecture, their careful record-keeping, their emphasis on moral conduct all stem from this consciousness of eternity. As the ancient sage Tahotep advised, "Great is truth, lasting in effect, undisturbed since the time of Osiris." For the pharaoh, these concerns were magnified beyond measure. As both divine incarnation and human ruler, the pharaoh served as the linchpin holding together the cosmic and earthly orders. His preserved body represented not merely his personal salvation, but the continued stability of the universe itself. The democratization of eternity. During the Old Kingdom, circa 2686 to 181 BCE, the elaborate preparations for eternity were largely the province of royalty and the highest elites. The massive pyramids at Giza stand as testament to this early monopoly on afterlife privileges. However, as Egyptian civilization evolved through the Middle and New Kingdoms, the possibility of a blessed afterlife gradually extended to broader segments of society. This democratization of eternity represented one of history's most significant spiritual revolutions. Increasingly, merchants, artisans, and even skilled laborers began preparing for their own journeys to the field of reeds. The evidence lies in the proliferation of more modest tombs, simpler mummification techniques, and mass-produced funerary texts. Yet even as preservation became more accessible, it remained an expensive proposition. A family might save for generations to afford even a basic mummification. The social stratification of Egyptian society thus extended into death. The wealthy received elaborate treatment with the finest resins and oils, while the less affluent made do with simpler techniques. Osiris, the template for resurrection. At the heart of Egyptian mortuary beliefs stood Osiris, god of the afterlife and resurrection. His mythic cycle provided both explanation and template for the mummification process. According to legend, Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Seth, who dismembered the body into 14 pieces and scattered them throughout Egypt. Isis, Osiris's devoted wife, recovered and reassembled the fragments, creating the first mummy. Through her magical prowess and unfaltering devotion, Osiris was resurrected, not to return to normal life, but to reign eternally as Lord of the underworld. This powerful myth established the pattern every Egyptian hoped to follow. Like Osiris, they too would face bodily dissolution. Like Osiris, they required careful reassembly and preservation. And like Osiris, they hoped for resurrection into an eternal existence. When embalmers worked on a body, they were not merely technicians, but participants in a sacred reenactment. Each bandage they applied, each spell they recited, echoed the actions of Isis herself. The deceased was explicitly identified with Osiris, often addressed as the Osiris name in funerary texts. The Book of the Dead, a traveler's guide. No discussion of Egyptian mortuary beliefs would be complete without mention of the Book of the Dead. That collection of spells, prayers, and instructions meant to guide the deceased through the perils of the afterlife. Despite its ominous name, a modern invention, this text was actually titled by the Egyptians as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, reflecting its optimistic purpose. Typically written on papyrus and placed within the tomb, the Book of the Dead contained vital knowledge for the soul's journey: how to overcome supernatural obstacles, how to address various deities, and perhaps most crucially, what to say during the weighing of the heart. This ceremony, overseen by Anubis and judged by Osiris, determined whether the deceased had lived a worthy life. The famous negative confession contained in the Book of the Dead represents one of humanity's earliest moral codes. In it, the deceased proclaimed, "I have not committed sin. I have not killed. I have not caused pain. I have not stolen. I have not told lies." This litany of denied transgressions reveals a civilization deeply concerned with ethical conduct, motivated not merely by social cohesion, but by cosmic judgment. The landscape of the afterlife. The Egyptians conceived of the afterlife as a perilous landscape the soul must navigate. The Book of the Dead describes fearsome guardians at various gates, rivers of fire, lakes of snakes, and other supernatural hazards. Yet beyond these dangers lay the field of reeds, Aru, a perfected version of Egypt itself, where the blessed dead would enjoy an idealized existence. This paradise reflected the agricultural preoccupations of Egyptian civilization: fertile fields, abundant harvests, and the life-giving presence of the Nile. Yet it transcended mere subsistence, offering intellectual and spiritual fulfillment as well. The deceased could sail with Ra on his solar bark, converse with the gods, or simply enjoy the pleasures of an existence free from pain, hunger, or fear. To reach this blessed state, however, the soul needed its body, not merely intact but recognizable, preserved against decay, and ritually empowered. Without proper mummification, even the most virtuous Egyptian might become lost in the treacherous afterlife landscape. Preparing for departure. Long before death arrived, prosperous Egyptians began preparing for their eternal journey. They might commission their tomb while still in the prime of life, overseeing its construction and decoration. They selected funerary texts, accumulated grave goods, and arranged for perpetual offerings to sustain their ka. This preparation was not considered morbid but prudent, an extension of the careful planning that characterized Egyptian civilization. As one wisdom text advises, "Make your tomb enduring in the western desert. Make excellent your place in the necropolis." For the pharaoh, these preparations reached monumental proportions. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, with its estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, represents perhaps the most ambitious funerary project in human history. Yet even this architectural marvel served the same fundamental purpose as the humblest tomb: to protect the physical remains and provide a dwelling place for the spirit. The moment of transition. When death finally came, it initiated a precisely choreographed sequence of events. The body was washed with Nile water and palm wine, and the family began a period of mourning that would last throughout the embalming process. Professional mourners, often women, were hired to demonstrate grief through dramatic lamentations and gestures. The body was then transported to the IBW, the place of purification, where the technical work of preservation would begin. Family members typically did not witness this process, which was considered both sacred and potentially polluting. Instead, they focused on preparing offerings and ensuring the deceased had everything needed for the journey ahead. As the embalmers received the body, they did so with reverence, recognizing that their work would determine the eternal fate of the person entrusted to their care. They were not merely preserving flesh, but securing immortality, not just treating a corpse, but facilitating a cosmic transformation. The Egyptians understood what modern societies often deny: that death is not an aberration, but an integral part of existence. Not a failure, but a transition. Their elaborate preparations reflected not a fear of death, but a deep reverence for life's continuum. The carefully preserved body served as a bridge between worlds, allowing the deceased to move between cosmic realms. As we explore the technical details of mummification in subsequent chapters, we must never lose sight of this essential truth. For the ancient Egyptians, the preserved body was not merely an object but a vessel of potential. Not an end, but a beginning. The first step in an eternal journey that, they believed, we all must ultimately take. Chapter 2. The House of Purification, where it all starts. Sacred spaces of transition. As the soul prepared for its journey to eternity, the body began its own transformation in a place the Egyptians called Nefer, the House of Beauty, or House of Purification. These sacred workshops, typically located on the west bank of the Nile near necropolises, were carefully positioned between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Neither fully in one domain nor the other, they existed in a liminal space where the profound work of transformation could safely occur. Archaeological evidence of these embalming workshops remains sparse, as they were not meant to endure for eternity like tombs. Rather, they were functional spaces designed for a specific and sacred purpose. What we do know comes from rare discoveries like the embalming workshop uncovered at Saqqara in 2018, which revealed specialized tables, drainage channels, and remnants of the materials used in the mummification process. The Nefer was deliberately situated away from population centers, often near the edge of the desert. This location served both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, it kept the inevitable odors of death away from the living. Symbolically, it positioned the embalming work at the threshold between the verdant Nile Valley, representing life, and the barren desert, representing the realm of the dead. The embalmers, priests, physicians, artists. The men who performed the sacred work of mummification occupied a paradoxical position in Egyptian society. They were essential to the culture's most fundamental beliefs about eternity, yet their contact with the dead rendered them temporarily impure in ritualistic terms. They were revered for their knowledge and skill, yet somewhat feared for their intimate association with death. These practitioners were not merely technicians, but priests of the highest order, often associated with the cult of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. The chief embalmer frequently wore a jackal mask during ceremonies, literally embodying the god's presence during the sacred work. This was no theatrical gesture, but a profound act of channeling divine energy into the mummification process. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, recorded that there were specialized classes of embalmers, each responsible for specific aspects of the process. The parashistas made the initial incision, a ritually impure act that required immediate symbolic punishment. The tarakiutes removed the organs and applied the preservative substances. The priests of Anubis oversaw the religious elements of the process, ensuring that each technical step aligned with sacred requirements. Many embalmers likely received their training through family apprenticeship, with knowledge passing from father to son across generations. The most skilled among them served the royal household, preparing the pharaohs for their divine afterlife. Others worked with lesser nobles or, as the practice of mummification expanded to wider social classes, with merchants and artisans who could afford their services. The initial purification. Water and wine. The first phase of mummification, the purification of the body, began immediately upon the deceased's arrival at the Nefer. Attendants carefully placed the body on a specialized embalming table, typically made of stone with a slight incline and channels to collect fluids. These tables, known from archaeological discoveries and artistic depictions, allowed for drainage during the washing process. The initial cleansing used water from the Nile, not ordinary river water, but water imbued with sacred significance. The Nile was the lifeblood of Egypt, and its water represented renewal and fertility. Some sources suggest the water may have been collected during the annual inundation, when the river was at its most potent. This water was supplemented with Natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, to enhance its cleansing properties. Following the water purification came a ritual washing with palm wine. This alcoholic liquid served both practical and symbolic purposes. The alcohol content helped to disinfect the skin, beginning the preservation process at a microscopic level. Symbolically, wine represented transformation. Just as grapes change their nature to become wine, so the deceased would transform from mortal to eternal being. Throughout this initial cleansing, the embalmers worked methodically, treating the body with reverence rather than clinical detachment. The deceased was not referred to by name but addressed as the Osiris, explicitly identifying them with the god of resurrection. This identification was not metaphorical, but literal. Through the mummification process, the deceased was becoming Osiris, participating in the divine pattern of death and rebirth. Ritual purity and protection. The embalmers themselves maintained strict standards of ritual purity while performing their sacred duties. Before entering the workshop, they underwent purification rituals that included shaving their entire bodies, including their eyebrows, washing with Natron water, and donning special linen garments that had never been worn before and would be discarded after use. Their heads were often covered and, in the case of the highest-ranking priest, adorned with the mask of Anubis. This was not theatrical costuming, but a profound act of divine channeling. The priest temporarily ceased to be himself and became a vessel for the god's presence and power. When he spoke the sacred words over the body, it was understood to be Anubis himself speaking. The workshop space was likewise purified before and after each mummification. Incense burned continuously, not merely to mask odors, though this was a practical benefit, but to create a sacred atmosphere. Resins like frankincense and myrrh were believed to be pleasing to the gods and repellent to evil spirits who might interfere with the delicate transition of the deceased. Amulets and protective images decorated the walls of the Pernhefer. The four sons of Horus, Imseti, Hapi, Duamutef, and Kebesenuef, watched over the proceedings, as did images of Anubis, Osiris, and other deities associated with the afterlife. These were not mere decorations but active participants in the ritual, providing divine oversight and protection during this vulnerable transition. Silent knowledge, the unwritten wisdom. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the embalming workshop was the atmosphere of sacred silence that prevailed. Unlike other Egyptian ritual contexts, which often featured music, chanting, and dramatic recitations, the work of mummification proceeded in near silence, broken only by necessary communications and the measured recitation of specific spells at crucial moments. This silence reflected the liminality of the space. It was neither fully in the world of the living, with its noise and activity, nor yet in the stillness of the tomb. It represented a middle ground, a transitional state appropriate for the profound transformation taking place. The embalmers communicated primarily through gestures and whispers, preserving the sanctity of the atmosphere. The knowledge of precise mummification techniques was closely guarded, passed from master to apprentice through demonstration rather than written instruction. While the Book of the Dead outlined the spiritual journey of the deceased, no equivalent Book of Embalming has been discovered that details the technical procedures. This knowledge remained primarily oral, protected from those who might misuse it or fail to approach it with appropriate reverence. What little textual evidence exists comes from the ritual of embalming, fragments of which survive on papyri from the Roman period. These texts focus more on the religious aspects than the technical details, suggesting that the practical knowledge was considered too sacred or perhaps too problematic to commit fully to writing. Time's deliberate passage. The entire mummification process would ultimately require 70 days, a period determined by astronomical observation rather than biological necessity. Specifically, it corresponded to the 70 days during which the star Sirius, associated with the goddess Isis, disappeared from the night sky before reappearing at dawn, heralding the annual flooding of the Nile. This cosmic synchronization was characteristic of Egyptian thought, which perceived earthly events as reflections of celestial patterns. Just as Sirius disappeared only to return in glory, so would the deceased vanish from this world, only to emerge renewed in the next. The precision of this time frame, not approximated but exactly 70 days, reflects the Egyptian emphasis on order, accuracy, and cosmic harmony. During these 70 days, the family of the deceased observed formal mourning, often wearing special clothes, abstaining from certain foods, and refraining from personal grooming. Women in particular demonstrated grief through dramatic gestures, tearing their clothes, covering their faces with dust, and letting their hair hang loose and unkempt. Professional mourners might be hired to enhance these displays, their wailing believed to assist the deceased in their transition. Class distinctions in death's preparation. While the general process of purification remained consistent across social classes, the quality of materials and the elaborateness of rituals varied dramatically based on the deceased's wealth and status. A pharaoh's body would be prepared with the finest imported resins, the purest natron, and the most skilled practitioners. A merchant or artisan might receive a respectable but less elaborate treatment, while the poorest Egyptians made do with simple burials in the sand, relying on the natural desiccation properties of the desert environment. These distinctions extended to the physical space of preparation. Royal mummifications took place in specialized facilities within temple complexes, under the supervision of the highest-ranking priests. Lesser nobles might be prepared in dedicated embalming workshops with appropriate quality. Those of more modest means might be embalmed in temporary facilities or even adapted domestic spaces. Price lists for mummification services have survived from the late period, showing tiered options that accommodated different budgets. Herodotus described 3 levels of service, from the most elaborate, which included removal of the brain and viscera, finest resins, and extensive bandaging, to the most basic, essentially a purification of the abdomen, followed by dehydration and natron. Despite these distinctions, the fundamental purpose remained consistent across social classes: to preserve the body as a vessel for the soul's return, enabling eternal life. Even the simplest treatment aimed to achieve this essential goal, reflecting the democratization of afterlife beliefs that had evolved over centuries of Egyptian civilization. The tools of transformation. The instruments used in the embalming workshop were themselves objects of sacred significance. Made primarily of bronze, obsidian, and wood, they were carefully purified before use and dedicated to specific deities. The bronze knife used for the abdominal incision was associated with Anubis. The hooks used in brain removal connected to Thoth, god of wisdom and knowledge. Ceramic vessels containing natron bore inscriptions invoking protective deities. Archaeological discoveries of embalming caches, tools and materials buried near tombs after use, have provided valuable insights into these implements. A notable find at Thebes in 1936 revealed a complete set of embalming tools, including bronze knives, hooks, spatulas, needles, and specialized vessels for holding oils and resins. Most striking among these tools were the canopic equipment, specialized instruments designed for the removal and treatment of specific organs. These included ladles for handling the viscera, funnels for introducing preservative resins into body cavities, and specialized wrapping tools for preparing organs for storage in canopic jars. The embalmer's expertise extended beyond technical skill to an intimate understanding of human anatomy. While Egyptian medical knowledge may seem primitive by modern standards, their understanding of the body's structures, gained through centuries of mummification practice, was substantial. They recognized the significance of different organs, knew the major blood vessels, and understood much about skeletal structure and musculature. The language of purification. Throughout the purification process, specific verbal formulas accompanied each action, though these were often whispered rather than proclaimed. These utterances were not mere recitations, but speech acts believed to have tangible effects on reality. When the chief embalmer stated, "Your purification is the purification of Horus," this was not poetic comparison, but magical identification. The deceased was becoming one with the divine prototype. Much of this ritual language emphasized transformation and passage. Common phrases included, "Rise up, you have not died," "Your Ba belongs to the sky, your body to the earth," and "You are pure, your Ka is pure." These statements were not aspirational but declarative. Through the power of ritual speech, they brought about the very conditions they described. Documentation of these utterances comes primarily from later periods, particularly the Ptolemaic and Roman eras, when some aspects of previously secret knowledge were recorded on papyri and temple walls. The ritual of embalming, papyrus, though fragmentary, preserves some of these sacred formulas, revealing their emphasis on purification, divine identification, and successful transition to the afterlife. The abode between worlds. As the initial purification concluded, the body was now ready for the more intensive phases of preservation, the removal of the brain and viscera, the application of natron, and eventually the complex bandaging that would complete the transformation. Yet before proceeding to these technical steps, the embalmers paused for significant rituals, marking the completion of purification and the beginning of preservation. The chief priest anointed the body with sacred oils, applying them in a specific sequence to designated points. Each oil had its own formula of recitation and its own divine association. The 7 sacred oils mentioned in funerary texts included festival perfume, Hakenu oil, Syrian balsam, Nekanem oil, anointing oil, best cedar oil, and best Libyan oil. Their application was not merely cosmetic, but transformative, each contributing specific qualities to the deceased's eternal body. Following this anointing, the workshop fell into deeper silence as preparations began for the most sacred and technically challenging phase of mummification, the removal of those organs not needed in the afterlife, beginning with the brain. This procedure would irrevocably transform the body from a dwelling place of life to a vessel of eternity. The house of purification thus served as the threshold between life and afterlife, the sacred space where the deceased began their transformation from mortal being to eternal spirit. Here, through the skilled hands of the embalmers and the power of ancient rituals, the journey to immortality began in earnest. As the initial purification concluded, the body lay prepared for the next critical phase, the careful extraction of the brain through the nasal cavity. This delicate procedure, perhaps the most technically challenging aspect of mummification, would further distance the body from its mortal nature and prepare it for eternal preservation. Chapter 3. The Brain, Hook in the Nose Hole. The Paradox of the Discarded Mind. In the hushed atmosphere of the embalming workshop, as incense smoke curled toward the ceiling and the first phase of purification reached completion, the embalmers prepared for perhaps the most technically challenging aspect of their sacred craft, the extraction of the brain. This procedure, performed with remarkable precision considering the technological limitations of ancient Egypt, reveals a profound paradox in Egyptian thought. The organ we now recognize as the seat of consciousness was deemed wholly expendable in the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians, for all their medical knowledge and anatomical understanding, did not recognize the brain's significance. To them, it was an unremarkable substance, a kind of stuffing for the skull rather than the command center of thought and personality. In contrast, they regarded the heart as the true seat of intelligence, emotion, and individual identity. The heart, not the brain, would be weighed against the feather of Maat in the judgment hall of Osiris. The heart, not the brain, required preservation for eternity. This misconception, though startling from our modern perspective, makes sense within the Egyptian observational framework. The brain's functions are invisible, its operations silent and hidden. The heart, however, responds tangibly to emotion, racing with fear, pounding with exertion, seeming to swell with love. When a person died, the heart fell still, while the brain exhibited no obvious change. It is little wonder that the Egyptians identified the visible, reactive heart as the essential organ of personhood. And so, while the heart was carefully preserved and returned to the body cavity during mummification, the brain, deemed a useless, even contaminating substance, was extracted and discarded, typically without ceremony or preservation. This practice continued for thousands of years, across countless mummifications, revealing the extraordinary persistence of this anatomical misconception. The hook, the probe, and the nostril. The process of brain removal began with careful preparation. The chief embalmer selected specialized tools from a cedar wood case, bronze hooks of varying sizes and shapes, each designed for a specific aspect of the procedure. These hooks, known as manat in Egyptian, featured long, slender handles leading to curved ends of different configurations. Some were sharply hooked for breaking through the ethmoid bone, others more gently curved for extracting brain matter. Accompanying these hooks were bronze probes, spatulas, and rods used to navigate the nasal passages and manipulate tissues. The embalmer might also prepare a set of small linen swabs mounted on sticks for cleaning and drying the cranial cavity once emptied. Nearby stood a ceramic vessel to receive the extracted brain matter, typically an unremarkable container, reflecting the low value placed on this discarded organ. The body, still positioned on the embalming table, was arranged with the head tilted slightly backward, providing optimal access to the nasal passages. A small wooden block might be placed beneath the neck to maintain this position throughout the procedure. The face was covered with a thin linen cloth, with only the nostrils exposed, a practical measure that also symbolically preserved the deceased's dignity during this invasive procedure. Before beginning, the chief embalmer recited prayers to Anubis, requesting the god's guidance for this delicate operation, and to Thoth, the god of wisdom associated with medical knowledge. He might also address Horus, invoking the famous healing of the god's eye as a metaphor for the reconstruction and perfection of the deceased body. Then, working with remarkable precision, the embalmer inserted the selected hook into one nostril, typically the left, though this varied by period and regional practice. With skilled manipulation, he guided the instrument upward through the nasal passage until it reached the ethmoid bone, the fragile, perforated structure separating the nasal cavity from the cranial cavity. Breaking through, delicacy and force. The most critical and technically demanding moment had now arrived, the perforation of the ethmoid bone. This required both precision and controlled force. The embalmer rotated the hook carefully, applying pressure until the thin bone gave way, with a slight but distinct sensation of yielding. This created an artificial passage between the nasal cavity and the brain case. Evidence of this procedure is clearly visible in CT scans of ancient mummies, which frequently show damage to the ethmoid bone and nasal structures. The consistency of this damage pattern across thousands of mummies testifies to the standardization of the technique over centuries, passed down from master to apprentice through practical demonstration rather than written instruction. Once the passage was created, the embalmer withdrew the first hook and selected another with a different curvature, designed specifically for the extraction process. This hook was inserted through the same pathway, but pushed further into the cranial cavity. Then began the methodical, careful process of breaking up the brain tissue and drawing it out in small portions. The embalmer worked blind, relying entirely on touch and resistance to guide the hook within the skull. With small, controlled movements, he used the hook to macerate the brain tissue into a semi-liquid state that could be drawn out through the narrow passage. This required intimate knowledge of cranial anatomy, developed through centuries of practice and observation. Portions of liquefied brain matter were drawn out with each withdrawal of the hook, emptying into the waiting vessel. The process required patience. The complete extraction of brain tissue might take several hours of meticulous work. Throughout this time, the workshop maintained its atmosphere of reverent silence, broken only by the occasional whispered prayer or necessary instruction. Liquefaction and extraction. The technical challenge of removing an entire brain through an opening roughly the diameter of a modern pencil cannot be overstated. The embalmers overcame this limitation through liquefaction, transforming the solid brain into an extractable semi-fluid state. Some Egyptologists have speculated that the embalmers may have introduced cedar oil or other substances into the cranial cavity to assist with this liquefaction, though direct evidence for this remains limited. What is certain is that the process was time-consuming, requiring both patience and skill. The hook was inserted and withdrawn dozens, perhaps hundreds of times, each movement extracting a small portion of brain matter. The embalmer periodically paused to clean the hook on linen cloths before continuing the extraction. As the procedure progressed, the embalmer might periodically turn the head to one side or the other, using gravity to assist in draining liquefied brain tissue. At times, he might have the assistants gently rotate the body to access different regions of the cranial cavity. This careful manipulation continued until the hook returned with no further brain tissue, a sign that the cranial cavity had been successfully emptied. Evidence from mummies confirms that this technique, however laborious, was remarkably effective. CT scans of ancient Egyptian mummies typically show cranial cavities almost completely emptied of brain tissue, with only small fragments occasionally remaining in inaccessible recesses of the skull. Cleansing the empty vessel. Once the brain had been completely extracted, the embalmers faced another challenge: cleaning and drying the now empty cranial cavity. This step was crucial, as any remaining organic material could lead to decomposition, undermining the entire preservation process. Using specialized tools, thin bronze rods wrapped with linen at the tips, the embalmers introduced cleansing substances into the skull. Ancient texts suggest these likely included palm wine for its antiseptic alcohol content, aromatic resins dissolved in solvents, and possibly natron solution. These liquids were poured into the cranial cavity through the same nasal aperture used for extraction. After introducing these cleansing agents, the embalmers would carefully manipulate the head, tilting it in various directions to ensure the solution reached all surfaces of the cranial cavity. The liquid was then allowed to drain out, carrying away any remaining brain fragments and providing a final cleaning of the interior skull surface. The embalmer might repeat this cleansing process several times until the draining liquid emerged clear and free of tissue particles. The final step involved drying the cavity, typically by introducing dry natron powder or linen packs soaked in resinous substances with desiccating properties. Filling and sealing. Different historical periods saw varying approaches to the treatment of the empty cranial cavity. In some eras, particularly the New Kingdom, embalmers left the cavity empty after cleaning. In others, they filled it with materials that served both practical and symbolic purposes. Common filling materials included linen packs soaked in resin, which hardened over time to provide structural support to the skull's sawdust mixed with resin, creating a lightweight but stable filling, pure resin, poured in liquid form and allowed to solidify natron powder mixed with aromatic substances like myrrh, frankincense, or cinnamon. Among the most interesting discoveries from later periods are mummies with cranial cavities filled with solidified resin mixed with plant materials associated with rebirth and regeneration. These included juniper berries, cinnamon bark, and occasionally lotus petals, all plants with symbolic connections to resurrection and eternal life. Once filled, if that was the practice of the period, the nasal passage was typically sealed with a small plug of resin-soaked linen or a specially formed resin stopper. This sealed the cranial cavity from the outside environment, completing this phase of the mummification process. The brain's final journey. What became of the extracted brain? Unlike other organs that receive specialized treatment and preservation, the brain was typically discarded. Archaeological evidence from embalming caches suggests it was often placed in plain ceramic vessels and buried near the embalming workshop or tomb, though without the ceremonial treatment afforded to other body parts. In some cases, particularly for royal mummifications, the brain may have been placed in a dedicated burial pit within the tomb complex, though still without preservation. Egyptian funerary texts make almost no mention of the brain's fate, underscoring its perceived unimportance in the afterlife journey. This treatment stands in stark contrast to the careful preservation of other organs. The heart was returned to the body with prayers and protective amulets. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were preserved in canopic jars under divine protection. But the brain, the true seat of personality and consciousness, was discarded as mere waste material, a fascinating misunderstanding that persisted throughout ancient Egyptian civilization. Exceptions and variations. While the transnasal extraction method was standard practice, archaeological evidence reveals interesting variations and exceptions. Not all mummies show evidence of brain removal. Some, particularly from earlier periods or lower social classes, retained their brain tissue, which eventually desiccated naturally during the mummification process. Other variations included transorbital extraction, where the brain was occasionally removed through the eye socket rather than the nose extraction through the foramen magnum at the base of the skull, typically when post-mortem damage or disease made the transnasal approach impractical. Excerebration, brain removal, through a hole drilled in the back of the skull, a rare technique used in unusual circumstances. Royal mummifications generally follow the standard transnasal procedure, but with greater care and the finest tools. CT scans of royal mummies show particularly clean extractions with minimal damage to surrounding structures, suggesting the most skilled practitioners were reserved for these highest status procedures. Child mummies present another interesting variation. In many cases, particularly with very young children, the brain was left in place rather than extracted. Whether this reflected technical challenges posed by smaller anatomy or different spiritual beliefs regarding children's preparation for the afterlife remains a subject of scholarly debate. The misconception's legacy. The Egyptian misconception about the brain's insignificance had practical consequences beyond mummification. Medical papyri from ancient Egypt contained detailed treatments for heart ailments, liver conditions, and stomach problems, but almost no references to brain injuries or diseases. When head injuries are mentioned, they are typically treated as bone or scalp wounds rather than potential damage to the brain itself. This anatomical blind spot persisted across 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, despite their sophisticated medical knowledge in other areas. It stands as a reminder that even highly advanced civilizations can maintain fundamental misconceptions when working within particular philosophical frameworks. Ironically, the very practice of discarding the brain has provided modern Egyptologists with valuable scientific opportunities. Because the empty cranial cavities were often filled with resin or other preservative materials, the skulls of mummies typically survived intact, allowing detailed study of dental patterns, facial features, and even DNA extraction from remaining tissues. The modern discovery, European understanding of Egyptian mummification techniques developed gradually, with brain removal being one of the most intriguing aspects for early researchers. When Napoleon's expedition to Egypt included scientific teams in the late 18th century, they conducted some of the first systematic examinations of mummies, noting the empty cranial cavities and speculating on how the brain had been removed. In 1798, French surgeon Xavier Bichat examined several Egyptian mummies and correctly theorized that the brain had been extracted through the nose. However, it wasn't until the advent of non-invasive imaging techniques in the 20th century that the full extent and precision of the procedure became clear. Modern CT scanning and endoscopic examination of mummies have revealed the remarkable consistency of the technique across millennia. These studies show that despite working without visual guidance and with relatively simple tools, the ancient embalmers achieved astonishingly complete brain removals with minimal damage to facial structures. Psychological dimensions of brain removal. For modern observers, the extraction and discarding of the brain often seems the most disturbing aspect of mummification. It strikes at our understanding of personal identity, which we locate primarily in the brain. To imagine our most essential organ treated as waste material feels profoundly disorienting. This reaction highlights the vast philosophical difference between ancient Egyptian conceptions of personhood and our own. For the Egyptians, identity resided primarily in the name, Ren, the heart, Ib, and the various spiritual elements like the Ka and Ba. The physical brain had no place in this spiritual anatomy. Moreover, the Egyptians conceptualized death not as an ending, but as a transition requiring specific physical preparations. The removal of the brain was not an act of desecration, but of purification, removing unnecessary material to prepare the body for its eternal function as a dwelling place for the returning soul. For the family of the deceased, knowing that the brain was being removed would not have provoked horror, but reassurance, evidence that the proper procedures were being followed to ensure their loved one's eternal well-being. The silent procedure. Throughout the brain extraction process, the embalmers worked in near silence, with only essential communication and ritual utterances breaking the stillness. This silence reflected both the sacred nature of the work and the liminality of the space, neither fully in the world of the living, nor yet in the realm of the dead. When words were spoken, they took the form of specific ritual formulas tied to each action. As the hook was first inserted, the chief embalmer might whisper, "This is Thoth, entering to restore order. As brain matter was removed, impurity departs, purity remains. As the cranial cavity was cleaned, your head is purified as the head of Ra." These utterances were not merely ceremonial, but performative. They enacted the very transformations they described. Through the power of ritual speech combined with ritual action, the embalmers were not simply preparing a corpse, but actively facilitating the deceased's transformation into an eternal being. Legacy of a curious practice. The ancient Egyptian practice of brain removal stands as one of history's most curious anatomical misjudgments. A sophisticated civilization that could build architectural marvels with astronomical precision fundamentally misunderstood the organ responsible for their remarkable achievements. Yet this misunderstanding reminds us how knowledge develops within specific cultural frameworks. The Egyptians didn't lack intelligence or observational skills. Rather, they interpreted their observations through a particular conceptual lens that emphasized visible, tangible connections over invisible processes. Their mistake also underscores how persistent such fundamental misconceptions can be. For 3,000 years, across dramatic changes in Egyptian politics, religion, and society, this practice continued largely unchanged, a testament to the power of established knowledge systems to perpetuate themselves across generations. As the brain extraction concluded and the empty cranial cavity was cleaned and prepared, the embalmers shifted their attention to the next critical phase of mummification, the removal and preservation of the visceral organs. These organs, unlike the discarded brain, were deemed essential companions for the deceased's journey into eternity. By removing the brain, the physical seat of consciousness but spiritually insignificant in their understanding, the embalmers had taken the first major step in transforming the mortal body into an eternal dwelling place. The empty skull now stood ready to accompany its owner through thousands of years of silent waiting. Its most important resident departed not through the bronze hook, but through the mysterious doorway between life and afterlife that the Egyptians had spent centuries learning to navigate. Chapter 4. The extraction of organs in the four canopic jars, the sacred incision. With the brain extraction complete, the embalmers prepared for the next critical phase of mummification, the removal of the visceral organs. Unlike the brain, considered spiritually insignificant and discarded, these organs were deemed essential companions for the deceased's journey into eternity. Their careful preservation would ensure the body's completeness in the afterlife while preventing the decomposition that would otherwise begin in the abdominal cavity. The body, still positioned on the embalming table, was now prepared for a procedure considered so necessary yet so spiritually problematic that it required a specialized ritual context. The left side of the abdomen was cleansed with natron solution and wine, then anointed with sacred oils. The chief embalmer selected a specific tool for this momentous task, an obsidian knife with a wooden handle, often decorated with protective symbols or divine figures. This knife was no ordinary implement, but a ritualized extension of divine power. According to tradition, it represented the flint knife used by Anubis when he first embalmed Osiris, establishing the pattern for all subsequent mummifications. Some examples recovered from embalming caches feature handles carved in the form of animal heads, typically the jackal of Anubis or the falcon of Horus, symbolically channeling the god's precision and protection. Before making the incision, the chief embalmer recited prayers seeking divine guidance and forgiveness for the necessary violation of bodily integrity. Then, with practiced precision, he pressed the obsidian blade against the left side of the abdomen, making a diagonal incision approximately 10 to 12 centimeters long. The cut typically began just below the rib cage and extended downward toward the hip. The location of this incision was consistent across thousands of mummies spanning centuries of Egyptian history. It offered optimal access to the abdominal organs while remaining relatively easy to conceal during the final wrapping process. The left side was specifically chosen due to its association with Seth, the chaotic deity who had dismembered Osiris, a mythological parallel that both acknowledged and ritualized the necessary violation of the body, the scribe of Anubis and the ritual punishment. One of the most curious aspects of this procedure was the ritual that immediately followed the incision. According to multiple ancient sources, including Diodorus Siculus and ritual papyri, the individual who made the cut, sometimes called the parashistes or slitter, immediately fled the embalming chamber while other embalmers hurled stones and curses after him. This ritual flight wasn't a response to error or genuine anger, but a ritualized acknowledgement of the taboo nature of cutting open a human body. By symbolic persecution of the cutter, the spiritual offense was transferred away from the deceased and the other embalmers. The cutter, typically a specialized priest known as the scribe of Anubis, was well aware of this ritual requirement and returned to continue his sacred duties once the symbolic punishment was complete. In some periods, particularly the late period, this ritual became more symbolic than actual. The cutter might simply turn away while the other embalmers made threatening gestures. The essential spiritual function remained, transferring the ritual impurity of the body's violation away from both the deceased and the primary embalmers. This ritual acknowledgement of transgression highlights the profound ambivalence at the heart of mummification. The body needed to be violated to be preserved. Destruction was necessary for eternal continuation. This paradox was not ignored but explicitly incorporated into the ritual framework, transforming a potentially problematic action into a sacred act. The careful extraction. Once the ritual response to the incision was complete, the chief embalmer and his assistants returned their attention to the body. Specialized tools, bronze spoons, curved spatulas, and delicate hooks were laid out on linen cloths within easy reach. Now began the meticulous work of removing the internal organs while leaving the body's outer appearance as undisturbed as possible. Working through the abdominal incision, the embalmers first removed the intestines, carefully drawing them out and severing their connections. The intestines were immediately handed to an assistant who began cleansing them with palm wine and natron solution. Next came the stomach, pulled gently through the opening and passed to another assistant for similar treatment. The liver, considered particularly significant and associated with the goddess Isis, received special attention. Its removal required careful manipulation to avoid damage, as its intact preservation was deemed especially important. Once extracted, it was placed on a specialized tray, often made of alabaster or fine wood, for immediate cleansing and treatment. The lungs presented a greater challenge, as they were located higher in the body cavity. The embalmer had to reach up under the rib cage, carefully detaching the lungs from their bronchial connections before drawing them down and out through the abdominal incision. Despite the technical difficulty, ancient embalmers became remarkably adept at this procedure, as evidenced by the well-preserved lungs found in canopic jars. Throughout this extraction process, assistants stood ready with linen cloths to absorb fluids and natron powder to address any immediate issues of decomposition. The work proceeded with ritualized efficiency, each step accompanied by whispered prayers and invocations to the appropriate deities. The heart remains center of consciousness. Amidst the systematic removal of organs, one vital component was deliberately left in place: the heart. Unlike modern understanding, which recognizes the brain as the seat of consciousness, ancient Egyptians identified the heart as the center of thought, emotion, and personal identity. The heart was where decisions were made, where character resided, and, most crucially, what would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at during the final judgment. The chief embalmer took special care to leave the heart untouched, often reciting a specific prayer as he worked around it. Your heart belongs to you. It will not be taken from you. Your heart will speak for you in the Hall of Two Truths. In some cases, particularly in royal mummifications, protective amulets were already placed near the heart at this stage, though the main heart scarab amulet would typically be added during the final wrapping. The preservation of the heart in situ created technical challenges for the embalmers. They had to work carefully around it while removing the lungs and other thoracic structures. They also needed to ensure that the preservation substances they later introduced into the body cavity wouldn't damage this essential organ. The consistent success with which they navigated these challenges testifies to their anatomical knowledge and technical precision. In rare cases, typically resulting from error or unusual circumstances, the heart was accidentally removed with the other organs. When embalmers discovered such a mistake, they would carefully return the heart to the chest cavity, often with additional protective measures like extra resin coatings or supplementary amulets to compensate for the disruption. The kidneys, a curious case. The treatment of the kidneys varied across different periods of Egyptian history. In many mummies, particularly from the New Kingdom onward, the kidneys were left in place along with the heart. This practice likely reflected their relatively protected position deep in the body cavity, making them less susceptible to rapid decomposition. It may also have related to Egyptian conceptions of the kidneys as somehow connected to the heart in function and significance. In earlier periods and occasionally throughout Egyptian history, the kidneys were sometimes removed and preserved in canopic containers, along with the other organs. When this occurred, they were typically treated with the same care as the other viscera, cleaned with natron and wine, anointed with oils, and wrapped in linen before placement in their protective vessel. The inconsistent treatment of the kidneys across Egyptian mummification history highlights a relatively unusual feature of this ancient practice: its capacity for variation and evolution while maintaining its essential spiritual purpose. The techniques of mummification were not rigidly standardized, but adapted over time in response to changing religious beliefs, technical innovations, and practical experiences. The cleansing of the cavity. Once the major organs had been removed, the embalmers turned their attention to the now empty abdominal and thoracic cavity. This hollow space posed both a practical and a spiritual challenge. Practically, any remaining tissue might lead to decomposition, despite the subsequent desiccation process. Spiritually, the empty space needed purification to serve as a worthy vessel for the deceased's eternal journey. Using specialized tools, long-handled spoons, curved implements resembling modern surgical retractors, and linen swabs mounted on wooden handles, the embalmers meticulously cleaned the interior of the body cavity. They removed any remaining tissue fragments, blood or fluid, working with remarkable thoroughness given the limitations of their tools and the absence of modern illumination. Once the physical cleaning was complete, the cavity was washed with palm wine, valued for its antiseptic properties in association with rebirth and transformation. This washing might be repeated several times, each accompanied by specific recitations acknowledging the purification of the deceased. You are pure, your ka is pure, your ba is pure, your name is pure. Following the wine washing, the embalmers introduced dry natron powder directly into the cavity, coating all interior surfaces. This powerful desiccant would begin drawing moisture from the surrounding tissues immediately, initiating the preservation process from the inside out. The natron might be left in place briefly or scooped out after coating the surfaces, depending on the specific protocol being followed. The four sons of Horus and their sacred charge. While the body cavity was being prepared, other embalmers focused on the removed organs, beginning their transformation into eternally preserved essence. Each organ was carefully washed with natron solution, dried partially with linen cloths, and anointed with sacred oils. Throughout this treatment, the organs remained identified with the deceased. They were not anonymous tissue but essential components of the individual's eternal completeness. The prepared organs were then wrapped in linen bandages, often infused with resinous substances and protective amulets. The wrapping technique varied by period, but typically involved multiple layers of progressively finer linen, with resin applied between layers to create a sealed package. In the most elaborate preparations, particularly for royalty, the wrapped organs might be enclosed in miniature coffins before their final placement in the canopic containers. The containers themselves, the famous canopic jars that have become iconic symbols of Egyptian mummification, embodied profound theological significance. Each jar stood under the protection of one of the four sons of Horus, divine entities who served as guardians of the viscera and ensured their preservation in the afterlife. Im-Sidi, depicted with a human head, protected the liver and was himself under the guardianship of the goddess Isis. His human appearance connected him most directly to the deceased, and the liver he protected was considered particularly important for regeneration in the afterlife. Hapi, depicted with a baboon head, guarded the lungs and was protected by the goddess Nephthys. The association between baboons and Thoth, god of wisdom, created a connection between breath and divine knowledge. Duamutef, shown with a jackal head reminiscent of Anubis, preserved the stomach and was under the protection of the goddess Neith. The jackal's association with the necropolis made it an appropriate guardian for digestive organs. Kibisanuef, represented with a falcon head evoking Horus himself, watched over the intestines with the protection of the goddess Serket. The falcon's swift movement across the sky symbolized the desired freedom of movement for the deceased in the afterlife. These guardians were not merely symbolic, but believed to be actively present, protecting the organs from both physical decay and spiritual harm. Their images on the canopic jars, either as full figures or, more commonly, as the jar lids themselves sculpted into their characteristic heads, manifested their protective presence. The evolution of canopic storage. The practice of preserving viscera in specialized containers evolved significantly throughout Egyptian history. In the Old Kingdom, canopic chests, rectangular boxes divided into 4 compartments, were more common than the individual jars that would become standard in later periods. These early containers were typically made of limestone or alabaster, materials associated with purity and divine protection. By the Middle Kingdom, the classic form of individual canopic jars had emerged, cylindrical or slightly tapered vessels with distinctive head-shaped lids. These jars were crafted from a variety of materials, with calcite, Egyptian alabaster, being particularly prized for its translucent, luminous quality. Other materials included limestone, pottery, wood, for less wealthy individuals, and even precious metals for royalty. The New Kingdom saw further refinement, with canopic jars becoming more standardized in form while often featuring increasingly elaborate decoration. Inscriptions naming both the deceased and the protective son of Horus became common, as did painted scenes of the deceased making offerings to the guardian deities. The finest examples from this period represent remarkable achievements in Egyptian craftsmanship, with precisely carved features and inlaid eyes creating startlingly lifelike guardian heads. A fascinating development occurred during the Third Intermediate Period, 69-664 BCE, when embalmers began returning the preserved organs to the body cavity after treatment rather than storing them in external canopic jars. However, the canopic jars themselves remained important, now serving a more symbolic than practical purpose. Empty or filled with linen, these dummy jars maintained the ritual connection to the 4 sons of Horus, even as the actual organs returned to the body. The late period saw another variation, with elaborate wrapped packages of organs placed on the legs or beside the body within the coffin, still identified with their appropriate guardian deities, but no longer requiring external containers. Throughout these evolutions, the essential spiritual purpose remained constant, ensuring the deceased had access to all necessary body components in the afterlife. Royal exceptions: the case of Tutankhamun. Royal mummifications often featured variations on standard practice, reflecting both theological developments and the greater resources available for preserving divine kings. The mummy of Tutankhamun, discovered remarkably intact by Howard Carter in 1922, provides exceptional insight into royal canopic practices during the 18th dynasty. Tutankhamun's canopic equipment featured extraordinary elaboration. His organs were stored in miniature coffins of gold and precious stones, complete with protective goddesses at each corner. These miniature coffins were then placed within a magnificent alabaster chest with 4 compartments, each sealed with a stopper carved in the image of the young king himself rather than the traditional sons of Horus. This variation, the king's own image replacing the standard guardian heads, reflected the royal theology of the period. As divine king, Tutankhamun was himself associated with Horus. His own divine essence provided protection equal to or greater than the standard guardians. This adaptation of traditional practice for royal theology exemplifies the Egyptian capacity to maintain fundamental concepts while adjusting their expression to accommodate specific theological requirements. CT scans of Tutankhamun's mummy have revealed that his embalmers removed not only the standard organs, but also his heart, a significant deviation from normal practice. Scholars speculate this may have been an embalming error, perhaps resulting from the young king's unexpected death and the rushed preparation of his body. Alternatively, it might reflect specific theological beliefs of the post-Amarna period, when traditional practices were being restored after Akhenaten's religious revolution. Technical brilliance in organ preservation. Modern scientific analysis of preserved organs from canopic jars has revealed the remarkable effectiveness of ancient Egyptian preservation techniques. Organs that have survived in their canopic containers for over 3,000 years often retain identifiable structures and even microscopic features, allowing modern scientists to identify pathological conditions and study ancient disease patterns. The preservation process for the organs paralleled that used for the body itself, but with adaptations for the unique challenges posed by soft tissue preservation. After initial cleaning with natron solution and palm wine, the organs were typically treated with highly concentrated natron to draw out moisture. They were then anointed with specific oils and resins, selected for their preservative properties. Cedar oil appears to have been particularly important in organ preservation, mentioned specifically in several ancient sources. Modern analysis has confirmed its effectiveness. The phenolic compounds in cedar oil have natural antibacterial properties, while its aromatic components help mask the inevitable odors of decay during the preservation process. The embalmer's understanding of preservation techniques likely developed through careful observation over centuries. Without germ theory or chemical analysis, they nevertheless identified substances that effectively preserved organic material. Their knowledge was primarily empirical rather than theoretical, refined through generations of practical experience and passed down through specialized training. Preparing the body for Natron. With the organs removed and properly stored in their protective containers, attention returned to the eviscerated body. The empty cavity required preparation before the body could proceed to the crucial natron dehydration that would form the core of the preservation process. First, the abdominal cavity was thoroughly rinsed with palm wine, removing any remaining natron powder and providing a final cleansing. The embalmers then began introducing specific substances into the cavity, selected for both practical preservation and symbolic significance. Common cavity packings included linen packets containing natron, which continued the desiccation process from within sawdust mixed with aromatic resins, providing both absorbent properties and pleasant scent. Packets of spices and aromatics, particularly myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and cassia, and in some periods onions were included. Their antibacterial properties empirically recognized while their layers symbolized regeneration and rebirth. The specific mixtures varied across time periods and social classes. Royal mummifications might include rare imported aromatics like frankincense from Punt or cinnamon from distant eastern trade routes. Those of more modest means made do with locally available substances like native resins and herbs. Once the cavity was appropriately packed, attention turned to the incision itself. This opening, necessary but ritually problematic, required special treatment before the body could proceed to the next phase of preservation. The embalmer cleaned the edges of the incision with natron solution, then prepared to seal it using techniques that varied across Egyptian history. Sealing the threshold. In early periods, the abdominal incision was typically sutured closed using plant fiber cord or animal sinew. By the New Kingdom, more elaborate techniques had developed. The most common approach involved covering the incision with a protective plate, often made of beeswax, resin-soaked linen, or in elite cases, precious metals like gold or electrum, a gold-silver alloy. These plates frequently bore protective symbols, particularly the wedge-out eye representing the restored eye of Horus, a powerful symbol of healing and wholeness. The symbolic significance was clear. Just as Horus's eye was wounded and then restored to completeness, so the necessary wound in the deceased body was now healed and made whole. For the most elite mummifications, particularly royal preparations, the incision plate might feature elaborate decoration. The mummy of Tutankhamun included a gold plate over his embalming incision, inscribed with protective spells and divine names. Similar gold plates have been found on other royal mummies, though most have been stolen by tomb robbers, specifically targeting such valuable items. Once the incision was sealed, the entire body received a coating of cedar oil, resin, or other aromatic substances. This coating served multiple purposes. It began the dehydration process that would continue during natron treatment, it provided antibacterial protection, and it symbolically purified the body for its transition to sacred object, the canopic shrine, house of eternity. While the body prepared for its lengthy natron treatment, the canopic vessels containing the preserved organs required their own sacred housing. In tomb preparation, a specific location was designated for these crucial vessels, typically a shrine or niche within the burial chamber, oriented to the cardinal directions. For royal or elite burials, specialized canopic shrines were constructed, elaborate wooden structures with doors that could be ritually opened and closed. The finest examples, like that of Tutankhamun, featured divine guardians at each corner, gilded surfaces, and elaborate painted decoration. These shrines were miniature temples, sacred spaces protecting the eternal essence of the deceased's organs. The positioning of the canopic equipment within the tomb followed specific theological principles. Typically, the containers were oriented to match the body's position, with the jar containing the liver placed to the northwest, the lungs to the northeast, the stomach to the southeast, and the intestines to the southwest. This arrangement connected the preserved organs to both the body's original organization and to cosmic directional symbolism. Before the final sealing of the canopic equipment, priests performed specific rituals activating the protection of the four sons of Horus and their guardian goddesses. Specialized spells from the Book of the Dead were recited, particularly utterances designed to ensure the organ's eternal preservation and availability to the deceased in the afterlife, preparing for the great transformation. With both body and organs now prepared, the stage was set for the most dramatic phase of the mummification process, the complete dehydration of the body through immersion in natron. This substance, naturally occurring in the Wadi Natron, northwest of Cairo, would draw all moisture from the tissues, preventing decomposition and transforming perishable flesh into an eternal vessel. The embalmers arranged a specialized table or surface within the embalming workshop, typically formed of wooden slats that allowed for drainage. Upon this surface, they spread a thick layer of dry natron crystals, forming a bed upon which the prepared body would rest. Additional natron would be packed around and over the body until it disappeared completely beneath the preservative crystals. Before this immersion, a final anointing ritual typically occurred. The chief embalmer applied the 7 sacred oils to specific points on the body, each accompanied by ritualized utterances. The oil of cedar comes to you, the oil of the gods comes to you, making your limbs perfect. You join the great ones in the divine booth. You are established among the gods. With these sacred preparations complete, the body was ready to enter its state of suspended transformation, buried not in earth but in crystalline natron, entering a protected realm between life and death, where the profound alchemy of preservation would unfold over the next 40 days. As the embalmers carefully lowered the body onto its natron bed and began covering it with additional crystals, they were not merely implementing a preservation technique but facilitating a cosmic transition. The body, now empty of its perishable components, yet with its essential heart intact, began its transformation from mortal vessel to eternal dwelling place, a process that would continue in sacred silence as the workshop maintained its vigilant watch over the next crucial phase of the journey to eternity. Chapter 5. Drying with Natron. The 40 Days of Stillness. In the dimly lit chamber of the embalming house, a profound silence descended as the embalmers approached the next critical phase of their sacred work. The body, now emptied of its brain and internal organs, lay in patient anticipation of what many considered the most crucial step in the entire mummification process: the drying of the corpse with natron, the sacred salt of preservation. Natron was not merely a substance to the ancient Egyptians. It was a divine gift from the gods themselves. This naturally occurring mineral deposit, harvested from the dried beds of seasonal lakes in the Wadi Natron region of Lower Egypt, contained a powerful mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate. To the untrained eye, it resembled ordinary salt crystals with a slightly yellowish tinge, but to the embalmers, it was the cornerstone of eternal preservation. The body must become as dry as the desert sands, yet remain supple enough for the final preparations. One ancient papyrus attributed to master embalmers explained, "For in dryness there is permanence, in moisture only decay." The chief embalmer, often a high priest wearing the mask of Anubis, god of mummification with the head of a jackal, would carefully inspect the natron before use. The quality of this mineral mixture determined the success of the preservation. Too impure, and the body might not dry properly. Too caustic, and the skin could become brittle and damaged. The preparation of the drying bed. As the 40-day drying period represented the most time-consuming phase of mummification, meticulous preparation was essential. Embalmers first constructed a specialized drying bed, an inclined wooden table with drainage channels to collect the body fluids that would be expelled during dehydration. Some embalmers' workshops, discovered by archaeologists, revealed these tables carved with intricate scenes of the afterlife journey, a constant reminder of the spiritual significance of their technical work. The natron was prepared in 2 forms for the drying process: as a fine powder for covering the body's surface, and as larger crystals for packing around and inside the corpse. According to surviving Egyptian texts, Approximately 600 pounds, 270 kilograms, of natron would be used for a single royal mummification, a tremendous quantity that emphasized the importance of this resource in ancient Egyptian trade networks. Before applying the natron, embalmers performed a ritual cleansing, washing their hands in water infused with natron and reciting prayers to Anubis and Thoth, the god of wisdom who recorded the deceased's fate in the afterlife. This purification ensured that no spiritual contamination would affect the sacred process about to unfold. The entombment in natron. With solemn precision, the embalmers began their careful work. First, they filled the emptied body cavities with natron pouches, carefully packing the chest cavity where the heart, left intentionally in place as the seat of intelligence and emotion, was protected with special amulets and additional preservative herbs. The body was then positioned on the drying bed in a specific posture, arms crossed over the chest for royalty, or straight along the sides for nobles and wealthy citizens. This position would become permanent once the drying was complete, as the body would stiffen in whatever arrangement it was placed. Next came the complete covering of the body with natron. Layer by layer, the embalmers packed the crystals around every contour, ensuring no surface remained exposed to the air. Special attention was paid to the face, fingers, and toes, areas particularly prone to decomposition. The fingernails and toenails were often tied in place with thin threads to prevent them from detaching during the drying process, as their presence was considered essential for the deceased's functioning in the afterlife. For royal mummifications, the natron would be changed partially or completely midway through the drying period, replacing saturated crystals with fresh ones to maximize the dehydration effect. This additional step, rarely afforded to non-royal subjects, helped explain the exceptional preservation quality of pharaonic mummies. The chamber of transformation. The drying chamber itself was a space of profound liminality, neither fully in the world of the living, nor yet in the realm of the dead. Archaeological evidence suggests these chambers were typically located in the western parts of embalming houses, symbolically facing the setting sun and the entrance to the underworld. The temperature inside was carefully maintained, ideally warm and dry to accelerate the dehydration process. Small braziers, burning aromatic woods like cedar, might be placed in the corners of the room, not only to elevate the temperature, but also to infuse the air with sacred scents believed to repel evil spirits that might interfere with the deceased's transformation. Windows remained covered with linen cloths, filtering the harsh Egyptian sunlight into a diffuse glow while protecting the body from direct exposure. Lamps burned continuously, their flickering light casting dancing shadows across the walls, often decorated with protective spells and images of deities associated with rebirth. The air in these chambers was heavy with the mingling aromas of natron, resin, various plant oils, and the subtle underlying scent of mortality itself. Modern archaeological experiments recreating ancient mummification conditions have suggested the atmosphere would have been remarkably free of the typical odors of decomposition, as the natron effectively halted the decay process almost immediately. The 40 days of stillness. For 40 days and nights, a number with profound significance in Egyptian cosmology, representing transition and transformation, the body remained untouched, surrendering to the desiccating embrace of the natron. This period paralleled the 40 days of mourning observed by the deceased family and the symbolic 40 days that the soul was believed to need to adjust to its separation from the body. During this time, the embalmers did not remain idle. They prepared the canopic jars containing the preserved organs, crafted funerary amulets, and began the intricate process of creating the mummy wrappings. Most importantly, they maintained a continuous cycle of rituals around the drying chamber, with priests taking turns to recite protective spells day and night. The 40 days are as the desert's breath, drawing forth all moisture, notes one fragmentary text from a New Kingdom embalming manual. As the sun dries the Nile's flood, leaving fertile soil, so does natron prepare the vessel of the soul for eternity's planting. The chemical processes occurring within the natron-covered body were remarkably effective. Modern scientific analysis has revealed that the natural mixture of salts created a highly alkaline environment hostile to bacteria and fungi that would typically drive decomposition. Meanwhile, the sodium compounds drew moisture from the tissues through osmosis, reducing the body's weight by approximately 75% while preserving its structural integrity. The waiting and watching. In wealthy households, family members might maintain a vigil in adjacent chambers, separated from the actual mummification process, but spiritually connected to their loved one's transformation. Professional mourners, often women with specialized training in funerary lamentations, would perform cyclical rituals of grief, their wailing serving both as expression of loss and as magical protection against malevolent forces. For the embalmers themselves, this period required both vigilance and patience. They would periodically check the progress of the drying, looking for signs that the natron was drawing moisture effectively from the body. Though they could not disturb the natron covering, they could observe changes in the crystals themselves, which would gradually become damper and sometimes discolored as they absorbed the body's fluids. The chief embalmer might also look for subtle changes in the room's atmosphere, changes in the pattern of condensation on stone surfaces, or variations in how the lamp flames burned, as indicators of how the drying progressed. This blend of technical knowledge and intuitive understanding represented the culmination of centuries of refined practice. The psychological dimension. The 40 days of stillness held profound psychological significance for all involved. For the family, it represented the liminal period when their loved one was neither fully present nor fully departed, a time when the boundaries between life and death seemed particularly permeable. Dreams and visions of the deceased during this period were considered especially meaningful, potentially carrying messages from the transitioning soul. For the embalmers, the 40 days cultivated a meditative relationship with death itself. Historical records suggest that master embalmers underwent extensive spiritual training to prepare them for continuous proximity to mortality. Some temples maintain special purification rituals specifically for embalmers to prevent psychological harm from their intimate work with death. One fragmentary text recovered from Thebes speaks of the embalmer's unique perspective. He who guides the transformation sees death not as an ending, but as the potter sees clay, a necessary stage before creation. The 40 days teach patience to the hasty and reverence to the careless. The moment of revelation. When the prescribed 40 days had passed, the chief embalmer would perform a divination ritual to confirm that the time was right for the next stage. This might involve burning special incense and observing the movement of the smoke, or consulting astronomical tables to ensure auspicious alignment with celestial bodies associated with rebirth, particularly Orion and Sirius. Once satisfied that the moment was appropriate, the embalmers would gather for the ceremonial unveiling. With slow, deliberate movements, they would begin removing the natron crystals, starting from the feet and working upward toward the head. This directional approach held symbolic significance, mirroring the journey of the sun god Ra through the underworld from west to east before rising again. As the natron was carefully brushed away, the transformed body would gradually be revealed. If the drying had been successful, the corpse would now be significantly reduced in size, the skin taut and leathery with a distinctive golden brown coloration. The features would be shrunken but recognizable, the body remarkably light yet structurally intact. The natron removal itself was conducted with extraordinary care, as the dried tissues were now somewhat fragile. Fine brushes made from palm fibers were used to sweep away the crystals, while priests continuously recited protective spells to ensure that the soul's vessel remained undamaged during this delicate transition. Inspection and assessment. Once fully revealed, the body underwent careful inspection by the chief embalmer. The quality of preservation at this stage would determine the body's ability to survive for eternity, and therefore the deceased's prospects in the afterlife. The embalmer looked for areas that might have dried unevenly or showed signs of inadequate preservation. The ideal outcome was a body perfectly dried, yet still maintaining its essential form, neither too desiccated and brittle nor insufficiently preserved. The skin should be dry but flexible, the features recognizable, and no signs of decay present anywhere on the corpse. If any areas showed inadequate drying, they might receive additional treatment with concentrated natron paste or special preservative resins before the next stages could proceed. For royal mummifications, this inspection was particularly rigorous, sometimes involving divination rituals to confirm that the pharaoh's divine body had been properly prepared. Transition to the next phase. With the natron removal complete and the inspection passed, the body now stood at the threshold of the next great stage in its journey toward immortality. Over the coming days, it would receive complex treatments with oils and resins to restore flexibility and provide additional preservative protection. The embalmers would clean their working area thoroughly, sweeping away the used natron, which, having absorbed bodily fluids, was considered spiritually potent and subject to careful disposal protocols, and preparing for the application of the precious unguents and wrappings that would complete the transformation. As one ancient text poetically described this moment, "From the embrace of Natron, the Eternal One emerges, no longer flesh that fails, but a vessel purified, awaiting the oils of immortality. 40 days of stillness have rendered what was perishable into what shall endure through the revolutions of the stars." The 40 days of drying represented not merely a technical necessity, but a profound spiritual metamorphosis, the alchemical transformation of mortal remains into an everlasting dwelling for the soul. Through the desiccating power of Natron, what was once vulnerable to decay had been rendered capable of lasting through eternity, ready to serve its owner in the endless days of the afterlife. Chapter 6. Stuffing, Oiling, and Scenting the Corpse. After the 40 days of drying had transformed the body into a shrunken, leathery vessel, the embalmers faced a critical transition. The natron had effectively halted decay and removed moisture, but had also left the body drastically reduced in size. The skin collapsed against bone, the features sunken and unrecognizable. Now began the delicate process of restoration, of returning a lifelike appearance and dignity to what would serve as the eternal dwelling for the deceased Ka and Bay spirits. The initial cleansing dawn would break over the embalming house as the embalmers prepared for this new phase. The natron-dried body, now significantly lighter than in life, was carefully transferred from the drying bed to the embalming table, a flat stone surface often carved with channels to collect excess fluids and inscribed with protective hieroglyphs along its edges. Before any restorative work could begin, a ritual cleansing was performed. The chief embalmer would wash his hands in water infused with natron and don fresh linen garments, sometimes changing his mask from that of Anubis, who had overseen the drying, to one representing Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, who would guide the precise work ahead. The body itself received a gentle cleansing with palm wine and water from the Nile, considered sacred and purifying. This washing removed any remaining natron crystals and prepared the skin for the absorption of the precious oils and resins to come. As the embalmers worked, priests would recite from the Book of the Dead, "Purified are you with natron, cleansed are you with water. You emerge pure as Osiris emerged pure from the embrace of the night. May your flesh be firm, may your bones be silver, may your limbs be gold, as befits one who shall live forever." Restoring the form. The body, now thoroughly dried, needed to regain a more lifelike appearance. The hollow cavities left by the removal of internal organs and the collapse of tissues during drying created an unsettling, withered appearance that would not serve the deceased well in the afterlife, where they were expected to appear in their idealized form. With methodical precision, the embalmers began the stuffing process. For ordinary citizens, this might involve simple materials, clean linen rags, sawdust, and occasionally sand or mud. For the wealthy and especially for royalty, more elaborate materials were employed: aromatic rushes, incense, myrrh pellets, and finely chopped herbs bound with resin. The embalmers worked systematically, beginning with the body cavity. Through the incision on the left flank, the same opening through which the organs had been removed, they would carefully pack linen soaked in resinous substances into the empty thoracic and abdominal spaces. Some surviving mummies reveal that occasionally small onions were placed in the eye sockets before stuffing. These were symbols of rebirth, with their concentric layers suggesting eternity. "The vessel must appear as it did in life," instructs one fragmentary embalming text. "Neither too full nor too hollow, but balanced as Mot demands balance in all things." For royal mummifications, The stuffing materials might include crushed cinnamon, frankincense resin, and cassia, exotic and expensive substances that reflected the divine status of the pharaoh. Archaeological evidence has revealed that Ramses II's mummy contained peppercorns placed carefully within the nasal cavity, possibly as a symbolic reference to the breathing of life-giving air in the afterlife. The limbs received special attention. Arms and legs were individually packed with linen and resin-soaked sawdust to restore their natural contours. Fingers and toes, essential for the deceased to grasp offerings and walk in the afterlife, were sometimes wrapped individually before the overall stuffing to ensure they maintained their proper form. The face of eternity. The face presented a particular challenge and opportunity for the embalmers. As the primary means of recognition, both for living visitors to the tomb and for the returning K spirit, the face needed to maintain a recognizable resemblance to the deceased. With extraordinary delicacy, embalmers would stuff the cheeks with linen and resin pads to restore the natural fullness lost during desiccation. The mouth, often collapsed inward, would be packed with scented wax or special linen soaked in aromatic solutions. The lips carefully positioned to create a serene expression, neither smiling nor frowning, but peaceful in eternal repose. The most specialized work involved the eyes. The dried eyeballs, sunken during desiccation, were rarely adequate for an eternal visage. Instead, artificial eyes were created for insertion into the sockets. For common mummies, these might be simple painted stones or linen pads. For the elite, particularly during the New Kingdom period, remarkably sophisticated eyes were crafted from white limestone or alabaster for the whites, with rock crystal or obsidian for the iris, often inlaid with black resin to create the pupil. One text refers to these as the eyes that see beyond seeing, emphasizing their spiritual function rather than mere aesthetic value. These artificial eyes were designed not for the deceased to physically see, but to symbolically perceive the spiritual realm and to gaze eternally at the rising sun, embodying the daily rebirth that the mummy would experience. The sacred oils and unguents. With the body now restored to a more lifelike form through careful stuffing, the embalmers turned to perhaps the most aromatic and sensory phase of the entire mummification process, the application of oils, resins, and unguents that would both preserve the tissues and imbue them with divine properties. The selection of these substances represented the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian pharmacology and perfumery. Their compositions were closely guarded secrets, passed down within embalming families and temple schools. Modern chemical analysis of mummy tissue has revealed complex mixtures that combine plant resins, frankincense, myrrh, and pistacia, animal fats, beeswax, plant oils, especially cedar, juniper, and castor, and rare aromatic compounds imported from distant lands through elaborate trade networks. 7 are the sacred oils, notes one New Kingdom text, each with its purpose, each with its power, together creating what neither time nor chaos may destroy. The application process followed precise ritual protocols. The chief embalmer would begin at the head, working downward to the feet, the same directional flow that would later guide the wrapping process. Each body part received specific treatments according to its symbolic importance. The head, seat of identity, received the most precious oils, often including imported cedar oil, with its powerful preservative properties. For royal mummifications, pure frankincense might be melted and painted directly onto the skin with special brushes made from palm fibers. This valuable resin, harvested from boswellia trees in distant lands like Punt, modern Somalia and Ethiopia, created a golden transparent coating with remarkable antibacterial properties while simultaneously symbolizing the divine golden flesh of the gods. The hands and feet received special attention, as these were considered the primary instruments of agency in the afterlife. Beeswax mixed with juniper oil might be worked between the fingers and toes, restoring flexibility while providing additional preservation. For pharaohs, the soles of the feet might be anointed with special unguents, associated with the gods Geb, earth, and Tatnan, the primordial mound, symbolically preparing them to walk on sacred ground. The scenting ceremony. As the oils and resins were absorbed into the dried tissues, gradually rendering them supple and aromatic, a formal scenting ceremony would often take place. This ritual aspect transformed what might seem like a purely technical procedure into a profound spiritual event. High-ranking priests would join the embalmers, bringing censers burning special incense blends. The smoke would envelop the body while chants invoking Nefertum, the lotus god associated with perfume, filled the chamber. This was not merely aesthetic but functional. The aromatic smoke was believed to repel malevolent entities while attracting beneficial divine attention. For royal mummifications, this ceremony might include the formal presentation of ingredients brought from the temple treasuries, alabaster jars of sacred oils sealed since the previous pharaoh's reign, frankincense tears collected from royal expeditions, and myrrh pellets stored in gold containers. Each would be ceremonially presented, its divine origins recited before application. The scent rises as prayers rise, one embalming papyrus notes. Through fragrance, the body becomes divine, no longer a thing of this world, but of the realm beyond stars. The most precious of all substances was the mysterious oil of Osiris, a compound so secret that its exact composition remains unknown despite modern chemical analysis of mummy tissues. This dark, resinous substance was reserved for application to the face, particularly the lips, and was believed to confer aspects of divine resurrection directly from Osiris himself onto the deceased. The blackening, one of the most visually dramatic aspects of this phase, was what Egyptologists call the blackening, the deliberate darkening of the skin through the application of heated bitumen and resinous compounds. Far from being merely a side effect of preservation techniques, this darkening held profound symbolic significance. Black was the color of fertility and rebirth in ancient Egyptian symbolism, associated with the life-giving silt deposited by the Nile's annual flood. By turning the skin black, embalmers deliberately linked the deceased to Osiris, whose skin was depicted as black or green in Egyptian art, representing resurrection and new life springing from death. The process involved painting or immersing the body in heated resinous substances that might include bitumen, particularly in later periods, tree resins, plant pitches, and beeswax. When cooled, these created a protective shell that further sealed the tissues from moisture and air, while simultaneously transforming the deceased symbolically into an Osiris. For royal mummies, the blackening might be selective rather than complete, with certain body parts, notably the face, receiving lighter treatments to maintain recognizability while the torso and limbs were fully blackened. Archaeological evidence from royal mummies shows that sometimes gold leaf would be applied to fingers and toes after the blackening process, creating a striking contrast that emphasized the divine nature of the pharaoh's extremities. The fingernails and hair, particular attention was paid to the details that most humanize a body, the fingernails, toenails, and hair. These features, easily lost during the drying and handling process, held special significance for the ancient Egyptians. If the nails had become loose during the drying process, they would be carefully reattached using thin threads of linen soaked in resin, tied around each finger or toe. In some cases, especially for royalty, artificial nails of thin gold sheet might be fashioned and attached over the natural nails. This was not merely decorative, but symbolically significant, the imperishable metal representing the eternal nature of these bodily features. Hair presented its own challenges. The desiccation process often resulted in hair loss, particularly problematic in a culture where hairstyles held significant social and religious meaning. For common mummies, the head might simply be wrapped without special treatment. For the elite, however, elaborate solutions were employed. If sufficient natural hair remained, it would be carefully cleaned with aromatic oils and arranged in a style appropriate to the deceased's gender and status. For women, this might include long braids or the application of henna. For men, shorter styles prevailed, occasionally with false beards attached for those of high status. In cases of significant hair loss, wigs might be created from human hair, sheep's wool, or plant fibers, attached to the scalp with beeswax and resin mixtures. Archaeological evidence reveals that Queen Tiye, mother of Akhenaten, was provided with an elaborate wig as part of her mummification, carefully styled according to the royal fashion of her lifetime, the hands and the position of power. As the body absorbed the oils and resins, gradually becoming more supple, The embalmers would arrange the arms and hands in positions of profound symbolic significance. These positions were not arbitrary, but communicated vital information about the deceased's status and gender. For male mummies, particularly those of pharaohs, the arms were typically folded across the chest with hands resting on opposite shoulders, forming an X, the same position taken by the god Osiris. This crossed arms position symbolized royalty and divine authority. Variations existed. Sometimes one arm might lie straight while the other crossed the chest, particularly during the Middle Kingdom period. For queens and noble women, the arms were more commonly positioned straight alongside the body, hands resting on the thighs with palms down in a position of receptivity. This gender distinction reflected social hierarchies that extended into the afterlife. For priests, special positions might reflect their particular divine service. The left arm bent across the chest, for instance, mimicking the stance taken when presenting offerings to the gods. Military officials might have their right arm slightly bent, as if holding the staff of command. These positioning choices were made permanent through the application of additional resins and temporary bindings that held the limbs in place until the final wrapping. The symbolism was so important that in cases where rigor mortis or damage prevented ideal positioning, embalmers might attach artificial arms crafted from linen and resin over the actual limbs to achieve the desired arrangement. Final touches and divine markings. As the oiling and resin application neared completion, the body would begin to take on its final appearance. Darker, more uniform in texture, and exuding the rich, complex aroma that still emanates faintly from well-preserved mummies thousands of years later. At this stage, for those of sufficient status, the embalmers might apply sacred markings directly to the skin. Using a mixture of red ochre, charcoal, and gum arabic, they would paint protective symbols at key points on the body. The Eye of Horus over the incision on the left flank, the Ankh symbol of life at the throat, the Jed pillar of stability along the spine. For royal mummies, these markings might include intricate cartouches containing the pharaoh's throne name written in gold paint, typically applied to the chest directly over the heart. The heart itself, having remained in the body throughout the mummification process, might receive additional protective amulets placed externally on the chest before wrapping. The markings speak when the mouth cannot, explains one fragmentary text. They are words made visible on flesh, guiding the deceased through darkness. The body's transformation from corpse to icon. By the conclusion of this elaborate stuffing, oiling, and scenting process, the body had undergone a remarkable transformation. What began as a shrunken, desiccated form had been restored to a semblance of life, fuller in appearance, more dignified in posture, and infused with divine symbolism through color, scent, and positioning. The embalmer's art had effectively transformed a corpse into something else entirely. Neither fully body nor fully statue, but a ritualized object that transcended both categories. This transformation reflected the Egyptian understanding of death not as an ending, but as a transition requiring technical and spiritual assistance. One New Kingdom prayer captures this metamorphosis. What was flesh becomes wood, what was bone becomes stone, what was blood becomes water, yet you remain yourself, eternal one, dweller in the field of reeds. For the ancient Egyptians, this transformed body would serve as the eternal dwelling place for the Ka spirit when it returned to the tomb to receive offerings. It would provide the essential physical reference point for the Ba spirit as it ventured forth by day and returned by night. And it would serve as the physical component of the transfigured Akash spirit that joined the eternal stars. The body now stood ready for the final phase of its transformation, the elaborate ritual wrapping that would further protect it while adding layers of magical protection through amulets and inscribed bandages. As embalmers completed their work of stuffing, oiling, and scenting, they prepared to surrender the body to the priests who would oversee the wrapping ritual, continuing the deceased's journey toward eternal life. Chapter 7. Wrapping Ritual, a slow process of 15 days. As the embalmers stepped back from their meticulous work of stuffing and oiling, the transformed body lay in quiet dignity upon the embalming table, its features restored, its posture arranged, its skin gleaming with the dark sheen of applied resins and oils. Now came the moment when the physical preservation of the flesh would merge with the magical protection of ritual wrapping, a process so intricate, so laden with symbolism, that it would require 15 full days to complete. The sacred linen, material of eternity. Before the first bandage could touch the prepared body, months of meticulous preparation had already transpired. The linen itself, the primary material that would encase the deceased for all eternity, was not ordinary cloth, but a substance imbued with profound religious significance. Pure white linen, spun by virgin fingers, woven during the waxing moon, prescribed one ancient embalming text. For what clothes the body in life shall clothe it also in death, yet transformed as the deceased shall be transformed. For ordinary Egyptians, the wrapping material might simply be repurposed household linens, washed thoroughly and dedicated to the purpose. For the wealthy and especially for royalty, however, new linen of the finest quality would be specially manufactured in temple workshops. Archaeological evidence reveals that the linen used for Pharaoh Tutankhamun's mummification was of extraordinary quality. Some pieces with thread counts exceeding 500 per inch, far finer than most modern luxury fabrics. The linen came in various widths and lengths, carefully prepared for different parts of the body. Narrow strips might measure just 2 fingers wide for wrapping individual digits, while broad sheets could span several feet to encase the torso. Each piece would be ritually purified before use, washed in natron solution and dried in sunlight, never in shadow, while priests recited purification spells. Most significant was the color. The brilliant white of fresh linen symbolized purity and the light of eternity, contrasting dramatically with the blackened skin of the mummified body. This stark visual symbolism, black flesh enshrined within white wrappings, mirrored the Egyptian understanding of death as containing the seed of rebirth, just as the black, fertile soil of the Nile Valley emerged from the receding white floodwaters each year to bring new life. Preparation of the wrapping chamber. The transition from oiling to wrapping typically required moving the body to a dedicated space, the wabat, or pure place, often located in the most sacred section of the embalming house, or in a temple precinct for royal mummifications. This chamber would be thoroughly purified through fumigation with incense and ritual washing with natron water. The wrapping table, typically made of purified alabaster or limestone for the elite, would be arranged on an east-west axis, allowing the body to face the rising sun, the eternal symbol of rebirth. Around this central table, embalmers arranged their materials with methodical precision. Rolls of linen bandages, organized by width and length, rested on cedar wood trays to prevent contamination. Small alabaster bowls contained adhesive resins heated to just the right consistency for application. Boxes of amulets, organized according to the body parts they would protect, waited for placement between the layers of wrapping. Canopic jars containing the preserved organs stood in quiet witness, often positioned at the 4 cardinal points around the wrapping table, to mirror their eventual arrangement in the tomb. The walls of elite wrapping chambers might be decorated with scenes from the Book of the Dead, particularly the vignettes showing the wrapping of Osiris, the divine model for all mummification. Lamps fueled with perfumed oils provided both practical illumination and symbolic light, their flames carefully maintained throughout the 15-day process. The wrapping hierarchy. The wrapping process required a precisely coordinated team working under the direction of the chief embalmer, who now assumed the role of Anubis in the divine drama of resurrection. For royal mummifications, high priests from various temples might join the process, each responsible for wrapping specific body parts associated with their particular deities. Let the priest of Thoth wrap the hands that shall hold the stylus of knowledge, directs 1 New Kingdom Papyrus. Let the priest of Sekhmet wrap the feet that shall walk the field of reeds. Let the priest of Neith wrap the face that shall gaze upon eternity. The wrapping followed a strict hierarchy, beginning with the most vulnerable and symbolically significant extremities, the fingers and toes, before proceeding inward toward the core of the body. This methodical approach ensured that every part received proper protection while creating a symmetrical, aesthetically pleasing result. The first day, The digits of destiny. The wrapping ritual began at dawn on the first day with a purification ceremony. The chief embalmer would wash his hands in Natron water, don fresh white linen garments, and place the mask of Anubis upon his head. Assistants would burn incense around the body while priests recited from the Book of Coming Forth by Day, known modernly as the Book of the Dead. With solemn precision, the embalmers would begin with the fingers and toes, the extremities most vulnerable to damage, yet essential for the deceased's functioning in the afterlife. Each digit was individually wrapped with narrow linen strips, beginning with the smallest finger and proceeding to the thumb. The fingers must be wrapped with utmost care, instructs one fragmentary embalming text, for with these shall the deceased grasp offerings, hold the ankh of life, and make the signs that open the gates of the west. The process was painstaking. Each finger would first be coated with warm resin, then wrapped spirally from tip to base with a linen strip approximately 2 fingers wide. Between the layers of some wrappings, especially for royalty, tiny amulets might be inserted. A small D-jeweled pillar at the knuckle to ensure stability. A tiny wedge-shot eye at the fingertip to guide grasping. For a pharaoh, golden finger stalls, thin sheets of gold formed into finger covers, might be applied before wrapping, symbolizing the divine nature of the royal touch. Archaeological evidence from Tutankhamun's mummy revealed gold covers on each finger and toe, some inscribed with protective spells in microscopic hieroglyphs. The toes received similar treatment, wrapped individually with the same meticulous care. In some cases, small papyrus sandal amulets might be placed between the wrapped toes, magically providing footwear for the journey through the afterlife. By sunset of the first day, all 20 digits would be individually encased, transformed from vulnerable flesh into magically protected appendages capable of functioning through eternity. The second and third days, limbs of power. As the second day dawned, attention turned to the limbs, the arms and legs that would carry the deceased through the afterlife. The process followed the same direction as the sun's daily journey, beginning in the east, the right side of the body, and moving toward the west, the left side. The right arm would be wrapped first, beginning at the wrist and working upward toward the shoulder in an intricate pattern of overlapping bandages. Between layers, embalmers placed protective amulets at key points, a scarab at the wrist to ensure regeneration, a shen ring at the elbow symbolizing eternity, a papyrus scepter along the upper arm representing divine authority. Each layer of wrapping adhered to the previous one with applications of warm resin, creating a solid protective casing. The bandages followed precise geometric patterns, spirals, crosshatches, and horizontal bands, each with specific magical significance. Throughout the process, priests would recite spells from the Book of the Dead, particularly those associated with the restoration of limb function. Your right arm is the arm of Horus, forever powerful. Your left arm is the arm of Seth, forever strong. Rise up, place your arms at your sides, lift them in praise of the horizon dweller. The legs received similar treatment on the third day, wrapped from feet to thighs with hundreds of yards of linen. Special reinforcement might be applied at the knees and ankles, joints that would be needed for the deceased to stand and walk. Between the layers, embalmers might insert small papyrus or wooden amulets shaped like the hieroglyph for movement, magically enabling locomotion in the afterlife. For royal mummies, the quality and complexity of limb wrapping reached extraordinary levels. Analysis of Ramesses III's mummy revealed over 20 distinct layers of bandages on each arm, some inscribed with passages from the pyramid texts in red and black ink. Invisible, once wrapped but magically activated by their presence within the cocoon of cloth. The fourth and fifth days, protecting the core. With the extremities secured, the fourth and fifth days focused on the torso, the central repository of vital organs and the seat of life itself. This phase began with special attention to the incision on the left flank through which the organs had been removed. This vulnerability required particular magical protection. The embalmers would place a wedge-shot, Eye of Horus, amulet directly over the incision, symbolically healing the wound through association with the restored Eye of Horus. This might be followed by application of a molten wax seal impressed with protective symbols before the first layer of bandages was applied. The chest received a specially complex wrapping, with bandages forming a distinctive pattern reminiscent of the netting on Osiris's chest as depicted in temple reliefs. Between these layers, particularly over the heart, embalmers placed some of the most powerful amulets in the Egyptian magical arsenal. Chief among these was the heart scarab, typically carved from green jasper or serpentine and inscribed with chapter 30b of the Book of the Dead. This critical text prevented the heart from testifying against its owner during the final judgment. O my heart which I had from my mother, O my heart which I had upon earth, do not rise up against me as a witness in the presence of the Lord of things. Do not speak against me concerning what I have done. Do not bring up against me anything I have done in the presence of the great God, Lord of the West. The heart scarab placed directly over the actual heart, or where it would have been had it been removed, served both as protective amulet and as magical substitute, ensuring that even if the physical heart had deteriorated, its spiritual function remained intact. The back received similarly careful attention, with the spine considered particularly important. Embalmers often placed a sequence of D-jed pillar amulets along the vertebral column, symbolically reinforcing the backbone that would allow the deceased to stand upright in the afterlife. These might be accompanied by tiny cartouches containing the name of the deceased, magically ensuring the body would always recognize and reunite with its proper identity. The 6th and 7th days, the sacred head. The wrapping of the head, considered the seat of identity and the primary vessel of consciousness, warranted 2 full days of the most meticulous work. No part of the mummification process received more careful attention, for without proper preparation and protection of the head, the deceased might lose their identity and thus their chance at eternal life. Before wrapping could begin, final preparations were made to the face and cranium. Any artificial eyes inserted during the stuffing phase would be secured with additional resin. The nostrils, despite being packed with resin-soaked linen, might receive small amulets in the shape of the hieroglyph for breath. The ears, crucial for the deceased to hear the recitation of offerings and prayers, might have tiny golden covers applied, particularly for royalty. The wrapping began with the application of a linen face pad, a square of fine cloth placed directly over the features to protect them from the pressure of subsequent layers. For elite mummies, this face pad might be painted with the deceased's features, creating an additional magical backup of their identity. Next came a complex sequence of bandages applied in precise geometric patterns. The ears were wrapped individually, then the nose, then circular bandages encircled the head at various angles, gradually building up a cocoon of linen. Between these layers, embalmers inserted some of the most potent protective amulets. A gold or carnelian ujat eye might be placed over the forehead to provide magical vision. A small papyrus scroll containing the name of the deceased could be positioned at the back of the head to ensure identity. 4 small pieces of metal, gold, silver, copper, and iron when available, might be placed at the cardinal points of the skull to provide magical protection from all directions. For royal mummies, a gold plate inscribed with the Eye of Horus often covered the embalming incision at the base of the skull, where the brain had been removed. A particularly intriguing discovery from several elite New Kingdom mummies revealed tiny pieces of papyrus inscribed with the deceased's name inserted deep into the ear canals, ensuring the dead would always hear their name when called, even if the outer wrappings were damaged. By the end of the 7th day, the head would be transformed into an ovoid shape that would later serve as the foundation for the funerary mask. Throughout the process, priests maintained a continuous recitation of spells specifically focused on the preservation of identity and consciousness. Your head is the head of Horus, whole and complete. Your face is the face of Anubis, sharp of sight. Your ears are the ears of Wep-Wawet, keen of hearing. Your lips are the lips of Thoth, true of voice. May you see with your eyes, hear with your ears, breathe through your nose, and speak with your mouth in the realm of the justified. The 8th through 12th days, layers upon layers. With the individual parts now separately wrapped, the 8th through 12th days focused on unifying these components into a cohesive whole through additional layers of wrapping that encased the entire body. This phase transformed the mummy from a collection of protected parts into a single integrated sacred object. The process followed a mathematical progression, with each day adding more complex patterns of bandages applied in different directions, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, and spiral. These alternating directions created a strong, resilient structure that would resist damage and deterioration. Between major layers, embalmers applied warm resin to adhere the bandages together, typically using brushes made from palm fibers. The resin would quickly harden, creating solid shells between the soft linen layers. In exceptional cases, particularly for royalty, embalmers might use melted beeswax mixed with cedar oil instead of, or in addition to resin, creating an especially powerful antimicrobial barrier. The ninth day was particularly significant as it typically involved the placement of a full-body shroud, a single large sheet of the finest linen that completely enveloped the partially wrapped mummy. For elite burials, this shroud might be inscribed with religious texts or painted with a full-body image of Osiris superimposed over the deceased's form, magically transforming them into the resurrection deity. The 10th and 11th days saw the application of transverse bandages, wide strips running perpendicular to the body's length, alternating with longitudinal bandages. This created a basket weave pattern that distributed pressure evenly across the wrappings. Throughout this process, priests continued to recite from the Book of the Dead, particularly chapters dealing with the integration of body parts. Your head is joined to your neck is joined to your breast is joined to your belly is joined to your thighs are joined to your calves are joined to your feet. You are complete, restored, revived. Nothing of you is lost. Nothing of you is damaged. The 12th day often focused on magical reinforcement, with amulets placed within the outer layers to protect the mummy as a unified whole. These might include a large papyrus or golden amulet in the shape of a jed pillar placed along the spine to ensure stability and resurrection, or a golden sun disk positioned on the chest to associate the deceased with Ra's daily rebirth. The 13th day, the red linen. The 13th day marked a dramatic visual shift in the wrapping process with the application of the red linen bands. One of the most striking features of elite mummification, but also one of the most misunderstood by early archaeologists. Unlike the white linen used for most wrappings, symbolizing purity and light, the red bands carried distinct magical properties associated with power, blood, and solar energy. Dyed with madder root or red ochre, these bands created a striking contrast against the predominant white wrappings. The red bands are the blood of Isis, shed for her beloved, explains one ancient text. They bind the deceased with the power of protection, repelling all who would harm this Osiris. The red bands were not applied randomly, but followed specific patterns with cosmic significance. 4 longitudinal bands typically ran the length of the body, crossed by 3 to 7 transverse bands. This grid-like pattern created squares or rectangles across the body's surface, each space corresponding to the protection of a particular deity. For royal mummies, these red bands might be reinforced with actual gold strips or gilt linen, creating a shimmering network that would catch the light of oil lamps during the funeral proceedings. Archaeological evidence from several New Kingdom pharaohs' mummies reveals that some red bands were inscribed with spells written in gold hieroglyphs, invisible once wrapped but magically active within the layers. The positioning of the red bands was not merely decorative, but precisely calculated according to religious formulas. Their arrangement mirrored cosmic patterns, with the number and placement of transverse bands often corresponding to significant numbers in Egyptian religion. 3 for the divine triad of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, 4 for the canopic guardians, 7 for the celestial cow's vertebrae that formed the ladder to heaven. The 14th day, the final shroud. As the elaborate wrapping process neared completion, the 14th day was dedicated to the application of the final shroud, the outermost layer that would be visible within the coffin and the last textile to touch the mummified body. This shroud was typically made of the finest available linen, often with a higher thread count than any of the inner layers. For royalty and high elites, this might be an heirloom textile of extraordinary quality, sometimes woven with gold threads or decorated with applique work along the edges. Before application, the shroud would be ritually purified through fumigation with incense and sprinkling with natron water. Priests would hold it up to the light, inspecting for any imperfections that might compromise its magical efficacy. Once deemed perfect, it would be carefully unfolded and laid out on a pure surface. The fully wrapped mummy would then be gently lifted by multiple assistants and placed in the center of the shroud. With slow, deliberate movements, the embalmers would fold the shroud around the body, tucking and adjusting to create a smooth, aesthetically pleasing appearance. The final fold typically ran down the back of the mummy, keeping the front presentation flawless. Once positioned, the shroud was secured with additional red bands applied in a pattern specific to the deceased's status. For pharaohs, these final bands often formed a complex geometric design symbolizing the merger of the king with the cosmic order. Throughout this process, priests maintained a continuous recitation of chapter 151 of the Book of the Dead, the spell specifically concerned with the protection of the mummy in its wrappings. O you who wrap the dead, O you who shroud the motionless one, hear me, I am the mystical soul. I have come to protect this Osiris, name of deceased. I spread my wings over this mummy. I order what concerns it among the gods. The 15th day, the funerary mask and final rituals. The 15th and final day of the wrapping ritual culminated in the application of the funerary mask, the ultimate physical expression of the deceased's transfigured identity, and perhaps the most iconic element of ancient Egyptian mummification. Before this final step, however, a series of concluding rituals assured the magical activation of all previous layers. Priests would circle the fully wrapped mummy 7 times, sprinkling sacred water and burning specific incense compounds at each circuit. The chief lector priest would recite the spell for assembling a man's magic, formally uniting all the protective elements within the wrappings into a cohesive magical shield. The funerary mask itself had been prepared long in advance, ideally during the lifetime of the deceased. For ordinary Egyptians, this might be a simple cartonnage mask made of linen, soaked in plaster, and painted with idealized features. For the elite, more elaborate masks of wood covered with gold leaf, or, in the most extreme cases like Tutankhamun, solid gold inlaid with precious stones. Regardless of material, the mask served the same essential functions: protecting the head, the seat of identity, providing an idealized face for the Ka spirit to recognize, and transforming the deceased into a divine being through association with the golden flesh of the gods. The application of the mask marked the moment when the deceased was no longer merely a preserved body, but had become an Osiris, a potential divine being capable of resurrection. The precise positioning was critical, with the mask's eyes aligned exactly over the wrapped face beneath, magically providing eternal vision. Once the mask was securely in place, attached with linen bands or resin adhesive, final prayers would be recited, typically including the critical opening of the mouth spell that would later be performed again at the tomb. Your mouth is opened, your eyes are opened. Your mouth is opened so that you may speak with it. Your eyes are opened so that you may see with them. Your ears are opened so that you may hear with them. Your nose is opened so that you may breathe with it. Your heart is with you. Your lungs are with you. All your limbs are reunited with you. You are established among the gods, your brothers. The wrapped mummy, now complete, would be carefully transferred to a temporary wooden bier, often shaped like a lion-headed bed, where it would remain until placement in its coffin on the day of funeral procession. Embalmers would place protective amulets around this bier, typically 4 magical bricks representing the cardinal directions, and maintain a continuous watch until the funeral ceremonies began. The mathematics and materials of wrapping. The sheer material requirements of proper mummification wrapping were staggering. Egyptologists estimate that a royal mummification could use over 4,000 square feet of linen, enough to cover a modern tennis court. Even a middle-class mummy might require 1,000 square feet, representing an enormous financial investment in material alone. The geometric precision of the wrapping followed established mathematical principles. Bandages were cut to specific lengths determined by sacred ratios, with width-to-length proportions often following what we now call the golden ratio. This mathematical harmony was considered essential for magical efficacy. A properly proportioned mummy resonated with the mathematical order of the cosmos itself. The layering typically followed numerical patterns of magical significance. 7 was particularly important, representing completeness. Many elite mummies show evidence of precisely 7 layers of wrapping over critical areas like the heart. 3, representing the basic family triad, and 4, representing the cardinal directions and canopic guardians, also influenced wrapping patterns. Beyond linen, the wrapping process consumed other precious materials in surprising quantities. A royal mummification might use over 100 pounds of various resins and unguents. The amulets placed between layers could number in the hundreds. Tutankhamun's mummy contained 143 distinct magical objects within its wrappings. The psychological and spiritual dimensions. The 15-day wrapping process was more than a technical procedure. It represented a profound psychological transition for all involved. For the family of the deceased, each day of wrapping drew their loved one further from the world of the living and closer to divine transfiguration. Many families would participate in parallel ritual mourning, synchronized with the wrapping schedule, their grief gradually transforming into veneration as the deceased transformed into an Osiris. For the embalmers and priests, the wrapping ritual required intense concentration and spiritual purity. They maintained specific dietary restrictions throughout the 15 days, abstaining from certain foods, alcohol, and sexual activity to preserve their ritual cleanliness. Their work was understood not merely as preservation, but as divine co-creation. They were actively participating in the birth of a new Osiris. The slow, methodical nature of the process served important psychological functions. Unlike modern funeral practices that often emphasize speed, the Egyptian approach created an extended transitional period during which the reality of death could be gradually accepted while simultaneously transforming the distressing reality of physical corruption into the hopeful promise of eternal preservation. As one ancient text poetically expressed it, through 15 days of sacred work, what was broken becomes whole, what was dying becomes eternal, what was human becomes divine. This is the miracle of the wrappings. They hide to reveal, they bind to liberate, they conceal to transform. Legacy of the wrapping ritual. The elaborate wrapping techniques developed by ancient Egyptian embalmers represent one of humanity's most sophisticated early technologies for physical preservation. More remarkably, this technical process remained inseparable from its spiritual dimensions, each physical action embedded within a framework of religious meaning. When modern archaeologists unwrap or scan mummies today, they find not merely preserved bodies but complex texts written in cloth and amulet, three-dimensional documents that record ancient Egyptian concepts of death, transformation, and immortality. The precision of the wrapping patterns, the strategic placement of protective amulets, and the careful application of preservative substances reveal a culture that approached death with methodical care rather than fear. Perhaps most poignantly, the wrapping ritual represented the last physical contact between the deceased and the world of the living. Each layer of bandage was a final act of care, a material expression of the hope that physical dissolution could be overcome, that identity could persist, and that loved ones might meet again in the field of reeds. As the final strand of linen was secured on the 15th day, the body, now transformed into a sacred icon, stood ready for placement in its coffin and the journey to its eternal resting place. Through the methodical application of linen, resin, and magical objects, what had been a lifeless corpse had become something far more significant, an Osiris, equipped for resurrection, prepared for judgment, and ready for eternity. Chapter 8. The Golden Mask and Coffin Nesting. The Face of Eternity. As the final layers of linen were secured around the mummified body, the embalmer's work entered its most artistic and symbolic phase. After weeks of meticulous preservation and wrapping, the moment arrived to bestow upon the deceased their eternal face, the funerary mask that would identify them to the gods and to their own returning spirit for all eternity. The mask is not merely a covering, explained Nefertiti, a master craftswoman who had dedicated her life to creating these sacred objects. It is a transformation. Through this golden face, the deceased does not merely resemble their living self. They become Osiris himself, golden-skinned and divine. For the pharaohs and the elite of Egyptian society, these masks were crafted from solid gold or wood covered with gold leaf, their surfaces burnished to a brilliant shine that would never tarnish or fade. The most famous example, the mask of the young king Tutankhamun, exemplifies this tradition at its height. Weighing approximately 22 pounds of solid gold and inlaid with semi-precious stones and colored glass, it presents an idealized, eternally youthful version of the king. The creation of such a mask began long before the death of its intended wearer. Measurements would be taken during life, and skilled artisans would work from these specifications, sometimes guided by portrait sculptures to capture the essential features of the individual. Yet the masks were never meant to be purely realistic portraits. They embodied a perfect, idealized version of the deceased, eternally young, flawlessly symmetrical, and imbued with divine attributes. "We craft not what the person was," said Amenhotep, a goldsmith who had created masks for 3 generations of a noble family, "but what they shall become." In the afterlife, all imperfections fall away. The old become young again, the ill become whole, the mortal becomes divine. Our masks show this transformation. The eyes of these masks receive particular attention, often inlaid with rock crystal, obsidian, or other stones that created an unsettling, lifelike quality. The eyebrows and cosmetic lines were precisely rendered in lapis lazuli or colored glass. For royal masks, the divine cobra, Uraeus, and vulture symbols adorn the forehead, signifying the king's rule over Lower and Upper Egypt, even in the afterlife. The symbolic importance of these masks cannot be overstated. Through them, the deceased gained a permanent, incorruptible face with which to greet eternity. The gleaming gold symbolized the flesh of the gods, who were believed to have skin of gold and bones of silver. By wearing such a mask, the deceased literally put on divinity, facilitating their transformation into an Osiris, a resurrected being who had conquered death. The nested coffins. Layers of protection. Once the mask was secured in place, the mummified body was ready for encasement in its series of coffins, an elaborate system of nested containers that provided both physical protection and magical insulation against the dangers that might threaten the deceased in the afterlife. "Each coffin is a womb," explained Khnumhotep, a high priest who had overseen countless elite burials. Just as Nut, the sky goddess, swallows the sun each evening and rebirth it each morning, these coffins envelop the deceased so that they too may be reborn. For royalty and the wealthiest nobles, this nesting could be extraordinarily elaborate, with 3, 4, or even more coffins fitted one inside the other, each more magnificent than the last. The innermost coffin, which directly held the mummified body, was typically the most precious, often made of solid gold for pharaohs or gilded wood for high officials. The construction of these coffins was a specialized craft requiring multiple artisans working in concert. Woodworkers would shape the cedar or sycamore base, carefully joining the pieces with wooden dowels and adhesives made from animal collagen. Plasterers would then apply a smooth layer of gesso, a mixture of chalk or plaster with glue, creating a perfect surface for the painters and gilders who would follow. "The wood must be thoroughly dried," noted Senefer, a master coffin maker whose workshop had produced royal burial equipment for decades. "Any moisture trapped within will eventually cause warping and damage. We sometimes age the wood for years before deeming it suitable for an eternal coffin." Each coffin was shaped in the form of a mummified human, with a carved or molded face that ideally resembled the deceased. The hands crossed over the chest might hold sacred symbols: the Djed pillar, representing stability, the Ankh symbolizing life, or the Wa scepter denoting power and dominion. For royal coffins, the crook and flail, emblems of pharaonic authority, would be included. The decoration of these coffins involved an intricate program of religious imagery and texts designed to aid the deceased in their journey through the underworld. No surface was left unadorned. Every square inch carried protective spells, depictions of deities, or scenes from the afterlife journey. The language of symbols, coffin decoration. The visual language that covered these coffins was not merely decorative. It was functional, a form of magical technology that actively worked to protect and transform the deceased. Every image, every hieroglyph, Every symbol was carefully chosen for its protective or regenerative properties. Down the center of many coffins ran a vertical band of hieroglyphs containing a standardized offering formula, beginning with the words Hetep Dinesu, an offering which the king gives. This formula invoked divine blessing upon the deceased, ensuring they would receive bread, beer, oxen, fowl, alabaster, linen, and all good and pure things upon which a god lives for eternity. Around the head area, images of the goddess Nephthys would appear, while at the feet, her sister Isis was depicted, the two divine mourners who had gathered the scattered pieces of Osiris's body according to mythology. Their presence on the coffin magically recreated this mythological protection for the deceased. The colors themselves carry power, explained Neferenpet, a painter who specialized in coffin decoration. The blue of lapis lazuli represents the heavens and divine hair. Green signifies regeneration and new life. Red embodies both danger and powerful protection. Gold is the flesh of the gods. Black is the fertile soil of rebirth. The interior of the coffin was not neglected either, often painted with images of Nut, the sky goddess, stretching her star-covered body protectively over the mummy. The inside of the lid created a miniature cosmos in which the deceased would rest. Just as Nut swallowed the sun god each evening and gave birth to him again each morning, so too would she facilitate the rebirth of the deceased. When the lid is closed, whispered Khnumhotep during a particularly elaborate royal burial, the deceased is embraced by Nut above and rests upon Geb, the earth god, below. In this sacred space between sky and earth, transformation becomes possible. The middle coffins, bridging worlds. While the innermost coffin maintained the closest contact with the mummified body, and the outermost coffin or stone sarcophagus provided the ultimate physical protection, the middle coffins in a nested set served as transitional spaces, liminal zones where the deceased's transformation from mortal to divine being could progress in carefully managed stages. These middle coffins often featured an evolution in imagery, becoming progressively more divine and less human-focused as one moved outward. The innermost might emphasize the deceased's titles and accomplishments in life, while the middle layers increasingly depicted the deceased in the company of gods, participating in divine mysteries. The journey from human to divine cannot happen all at once, explained Amenemhat, a priest who specialized in funerary theology. It must occur in stages, like ascending a great staircase toward the stars. Each coffin represents one step in this ascension. The wood chosen for these coffins was significant as well. Sycamore was particularly prized, as this tree was associated with Hathor and Nut, goddesses who facilitated rebirth. Cedar, imported at great expense from Lebanon, was valued for its aromatic properties and resistance to decay. For those who could afford it, the precious nature of imported wood added another layer of status and protection to their eternal container. The joinery techniques used in coffin construction reflected the Egyptians' extraordinary woodworking skill. Dovetail joints, complex miters, and hidden dowels created seamless connections that could withstand the passage of millennia. The wooden surfaces were often covered with linen before plastering, providing a stable foundation for the elaborate painted decoration to follow. A coffin must never split or crack, insisted Sennajem, a master craftsman who had built coffins for 2 generations of nobles. Any breach would endanger the mummy within, creating a vulnerability through which harmful forces might enter. Our joinery must be perfect, our materials flawless. The anthropoid shape, the body divine. By the New Kingdom period, circa 1550-1070 BCE, the anthropoid or human-shaped coffin had become standard, a significant evolution from the rectangular coffins of earlier periods. This body-shaped design served multiple symbolic purposes, reinforcing the identity of the deceased while simultaneously transforming them into a divine image. The shape was not intended as a realistic portrayal of the human form, but rather as an idealized divine version, the body of Osiris, with whom the deceased was identified. The proportions were deliberately stylized, the face serene and symmetrical, the shoulders broad, the body tapering toward the feet in a mummiform shape. Through this coffin, The deceased becomes Osiris, explained Rahotep, a high priest of the cult of Osiris. Just as the god was murdered yet rose again through proper ritual, so too will the deceased triumph over death if correctly prepared and contained. The anthropoid shape also created practical advantages. The widened shoulder area accommodated the bulkier upper portion of the wrapped mummy, while the narrowed foot area saved valuable wood. The fitted shape provided better protection against shifting during transport to the tomb and reduced the empty space where insects or other pests might enter. For royal burials, these anthropoid coffins could reach extraordinary levels of artistic achievement. The innermost coffin of Tutankhamun, for instance, was hammered from solid gold weighing approximately 243 pounds, 110.4 kilograms. Its surface covered with intricate inlays of semi-precious stones and colored glass. Such objects represented not just the pinnacle of craftsmanship, but also a tremendous concentration of national wealth dedicated to royal afterlife provisions. The outermost layer, the stone sarcophagus. For the elite of Egyptian society, the nested wooden or metal coffins would ultimately rest within a final container, a massive stone sarcophagus hewn from a single block of granite, quartzite, or limestone. These monumental objects served as the ultimate barrier between the mummified body and the outside world, providing both physical protection and magical insulation. The word sarcophagus comes from the Greeks, meaning flesh-eater. Noted Imhotep, a learned scribe who had studied the burial customs of many lands. But our stone chests do not consume flesh. They preserve it for eternity through their impenetrable walls. The creation of a stone sarcophagus was a feat of engineering that began in distant quarries. For the most prestigious burials, red granite was favored, quarried from Aswan in Egypt's far south. Massive blocks would be cut using dolerite pounders, harder stones used to pound and shape the granite, and copper saws aided by abrasive sand. Once roughly shaped, these multi-ton blocks would be transported hundreds of miles by boat along the Nile, typically during the annual flood when water levels were high enough to bring vessels close to the quarries. From the river, they would be dragged on wooden sleds across the desert to the workshops where the final shaping and decorating would take place. It might take 100 men a year to create a single royal sarcophagus, said Kamwaset, a prince who supervised quarrying expeditions. The stone must be perfect, without cracks or flaws. The measurements must be precise to accommodate the nested coffins. The surface must be smooth as still water, ready to receive the sacred texts that will protect the king for eternity. The interior of these stone giants would be carefully hollowed out using copper chisels and abrasive sand, the work proceeding slowly to avoid catastrophic cracks that would render years of labor worthless. The interior was shaped to precisely accommodate the outermost wooden coffin, often with a raised area at one end to serve as a pillow for the head. The exterior surfaces were carved with texts and scenes similar to those on the wooden coffins, though adapted to the more monumental scale of the stone medium. Deep relief carving allowed these texts to stand out dramatically, especially when filled with colored pastes that contrasted with the polished stone surface. The lid of the sarcophagus presented a particular challenge due to its immense weight. Some royal sarcophagi had lids weighing several tons, requiring teams of workers using ropes and levers to maneuver them into place. Once positioned, these lids were effectively permanent seals, as moving them again would require a similarly massive effort. When the lid descends, observed Amenemhat during a royal burial, it is like the sky coming down to meet the earth, enclosing the deceased in a perfect miniature cosmos. Within this sacred space, time itself stands still, the gilded shrine, the outermost protection. For royal burials of the New Kingdom, the nested coffins and stone sarcophagus might themselves be enclosed within a series of gilded wooden shrines, massive structures that filled entire burial chambers. Tutankhamun's tomb contained 4 such shrines, each fitting inside the next like elaborate Chinese boxes, the outermost measuring over 16 feet in length and nearly 9 feet tall. These shrines took the form of rectangular structures with vaulted or gabled roofs, resembling primitive chapels or divine houses. Their surfaces were covered with gold leaf and decorated with religious scenes similar to those on the coffins, though on a grander scale. The corners and edges were reinforced with copper or bronze fittings, and double doors on one end allowed the shrine to be sealed with complex bolt systems. The shrine is a divine dwelling, explained Nefermat, a priest involved in assembling these structures within the tomb. Just as a god resides in a temple, the deified deceased, now in Osiris, dwells within this golden house. It is both protection and throne, shelter and palace. The construction of these shrines required not just artistic skill, but also logistical planning. They were too large to be carried into the tomb fully assembled, so they were designed to be broken down into components, walls, roofs, floors, that could be transported separately and reassembled in the burial chamber. "We must work with absolute precision," said Senefer, a craftsman who specialized in shrine assembly. "Once we descend into the tomb with these pieces, there can be no errors, no adjustments. Everything must fit perfectly the first time, for this is work done in the presence of the god." The final artwork, a biography in images. As elaborate as the coffins and sarcophagi were on their exterior surfaces, it was often the interior decoration of the tombs themselves that represented the pinnacle of Egyptian funerary art. For royalty and the highest officials, tomb walls would be covered with scenes depicting both religious themes and events from the deceased's life, creating a magical environment that would support their existence for eternity. The tomb is both a machine for resurrection and a book of the dead person's life, explained Neferhotep, a master artist who had decorated royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Through these images, the deceased continues to hunt in the marshes, to feast with family, to receive offerings from servants. What is painted becomes real in the afterlife. Scenes commonly found in elite tombs included the deceased hunting waterfowl in the marshes or spearing fish, activities that symbolize both recreation and the maintenance of cosmic order through the defeat of chaotic forces. Banquet scenes showed the deceased enjoying music, food, and drink in the company of family members, while offering scenes depicted an endless procession of servants, bringing provisions to sustain the deceased eternally. Agricultural scenes were particularly important, showing the planting and harvesting cycle that ensured prosperity. These images had a dual purpose. They both recorded the agricultural estates that might provide actual offerings to the deceased mortuary cult, and magically created an eternal source of sustenance in the afterlife. "Every tomb tells a story," noted Ramos, a scribe who composed the texts accompanying these scenes. "For some, it is a story of military achievements. For others, a tale of religious devotion or administrative skill. But all these stories share the same ending: the triumph of the well-prepared individual over death itself, the cartonnage, molded protection. Between the outermost wrappings of the mummy and the innermost coffin, many Egyptian burials included another protective layer, cartonnage. This material, made from layers of linen or papyrus soaked in plaster, could be molded when wet and once dry, painted and decorated to create a custom-fitted case that enclosed the wrapped body. "Cartonnage combines the best qualities of cloth and wood," explained Nefertiti, who specialized in creating these cases. "It is flexible enough to be molded precisely to the contours of the wrapped mummy, yet rigid enough when dry to provide protection. It is light yet strong, easily decorated yet durable. Typically, cartonnage was created in sections: a mask for the head and chest, a foot case, and panels for the torso and legs. These pieces would be laced together once positioned around the wrapped mummy, creating a seamless, protective shell. The exterior was then gessoed with a smooth white coating that provided the perfect surface for elaborate painted decoration. The imagery on cartonnage cases echoed that found on coffins: protective deities, offering formulas, and symbols of regeneration. Often the four sons of Horus, Imseti, Hapi, Duamutef, and Kebasenuef, would be prominently featured, as they were responsible for protecting the internal organs of the deceased and, by extension, the body itself. For less wealthy individuals who could not afford multiple nested coffins of precious wood, cartonnage provided an economical alternative that still offered both physical protection and the necessary magical imagery. During periods of economic difficulty, even members of the elite might substitute elaborate cartonnage for some of the traditional wooden coffins, allowing them to maintain the essential religious requirements while reducing costs. The final farewell. Closing the coffins. When all preparations were complete, when the body had been perfectly preserved, wrapped in layers of protective linen, adorned with amulets, fitted with its cartonnage case, and provided with its funerary mask, the solemn moment arrived to enclose the deceased within their nested coffins. This was not merely a practical action, but a deeply religious ritual performed by priests who recited specific spells from the Book of the Dead to ensure the deceased's successful transition to the afterlife. As each lid was lowered, as each bolt was secured, the physical world receded further from the deceased, and the divine realm drew nearer. With each coffin that closes, whispered Neferhotep, a high priest overseeing a royal burial, the deceased moves one step further from the land of the living and one step closer to the field of reeds. The outer world fades. The inner light grows stronger. The innermost coffin would be closed first, often sealed with warm resin that hardened to create an airtight bond. This most intimate container, which would rest against the wrapped body for eternity, might receive a final blessing or anointing with sacred oils before being enclosed within the next coffin in the series. Family members might be present for the closing of the outermost coffin, this final physical separation representing the culmination of the 70-day mummification and funeral preparation process. Tears were not discouraged at this moment. Grief was a natural and expected response, even with the confident belief that the deceased was embarking on a journey to a better existence. Do not think of this as an ending, the high priest might console the grieving family. Your beloved is not being locked away in darkness, but released into light. These coffins are not a prison, but a chrysalis, from which they will emerge transformed and eternal. Conclusion: a technology of immortality. The elaborate system of funerary mass, nested coffins, protective cartonnage, and stone sarcophagi represents one of humanity's most determined technological responses to the universal problem of death. Through this sophisticated layering of containers, each with its specific material properties and symbolic functions, the ancient Egyptians created not merely a burial method, but a technology of immortality. What appears to outsiders as excessive, reflected Amenhotep, a vizier who had overseen royal workshops for decades, is in fact precisely calculated. Each layer serves a purpose. Each material contributes its properties. Each image activates a specific magical protection. Together, they form a perfect machine for ensuring eternal life. The physical protection offered by these containers was significant. Many mummies that have survived to the modern era owe their preservation partly to the microclimate created within their sealed coffins. But for the Egyptians, the physical was merely the foundation for the spiritual. The true purpose of this elaborate nesting was to facilitate the deceased's transformation from mortal to divine being. As the final preparations were completed, as the last prayers were recited, the deceased, now wrapped, masked, encoffined, and enshrined, was ready for the next stage of the journey, placement within the tomb that would serve as their eternal home. There, surrounded by provisions for the afterlife and protected by magical texts and images, they would await the moment of resurrection when their Ba soul and Kai, life force, would reunite with their preserved body and true eternal life would begin. The golden mask would shine in the darkness of the sealed tomb, its features serene and timeless, waiting for the day when the deceased spirit would recognize this idealized face as its own. And through this recognition, through this perfect melding of identity, body, and spirit, the ultimate goal of Egyptian funerary religion would be achieved: the defeat of death itself. Chapter 9: The Tomb and the Final Ritual, the Journey to the Eternal Resting Place. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the desert sands in hues of amber and gold, a solemn procession emerged from the embalming house. The mummified body of the deceased, now fully prepared after 70 days of meticulous preservation, began its final journey to the tomb that would serve as its home for eternity. This was not merely a funeral procession, it was the culmination of a lifetime of preparation, the physical manifestation of the Egyptian belief that death was but a doorway to continued existence. The procession moved with deliberate slowness, each step taken with reverence. At the front walked priests, their white garments billowing in the desert breeze, burning incense whose fragrant smoke curled upward toward the heavens. A bridge between the mortal world and the divine realm. Behind them came professional mourners, their wails and lamentations filling the air, their tears genuine despite being hired for this purpose. The sound of their grief served a dual purpose, to honor the deceased and to ward off malevolent spirits who might interfere with the journey to the afterlife. "The soul must be guided," whispered the chief priest, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic chanting of his subordinates. "The deceased must know the path to take, lest they wander forever in darkness." The mummified body, encased in its nested coffins, was transported on a sled drawn by oxen. For a pharaoh or noble, this sled might be adorned with gold and precious stones, the oxen draped in royal blue cloth, embroidered with sacred symbols. For those of lesser means, the sled might be simpler, but the solemnity of the occasion remained unchanged. Death, after all, came to everyone, from the mightiest pharaoh to the humblest farmer. The tomb, a lifetime's construction. For the elite of ancient Egyptian society, tomb preparation began not in old age, not in middle years, but often from the very moment they ascended to power. A pharaoh might commission his tomb within days of taking the throne, understanding that the quality and completeness of his eternal home would directly impact his experience in the afterlife. "The tomb is not merely a resting place," explained Amenhotep, a master architect who had dedicated his life to designing these monumental structures. "It is a machine for resurrection, a bridge between worlds, a vessel that carries the deceased through the perilous journey that awaits." The construction of a royal tomb was a project of staggering proportions, employing thousands of workers over decades. Contrary to popular belief perpetuated in later centuries, these workers were not slaves, but skilled craftsmen and seasonal laborers who worked during the flooding of the Nile when farming was impossible. They were paid for their labor, provided with housing, food, and medical care, and they took immense pride in their contribution to these sacred structures. For the Valley of the Kings, workers would first identify a suitable location in the limestone cliffs. Initial tunneling would be done using copper chisels and stone hammers, the rock face moistened to make it slightly more workable. As the tunnel penetrated deeper into the mountain, the workers would use oil lamps to illuminate their progress, the flickering light casting long shadows on the rough-hewn walls. "Each stroke of the chisel is a prayer," said Neferkar, a worker who had spent 20 years helping to construct the tomb of Pharaoh Seti I. "Each bead of sweat that falls from my brow is an offering to ensure the king's eternal life." The layout of a royal tomb followed a pattern that evolved over centuries but maintained certain core elements. From the entrance, a descending corridor led deeper into the earth, symbolizing the deceased's journey into the underworld. This corridor might contain steps, ramps, or a combination of both. At intervals, the corridor would open into chambers of varying sizes, each with specific functions: antechambers, annexes, and the all-important burial chamber where the sarcophagus would rest. The walls of these chambers were not left bare. They were meticulously prepared with a layer of plaster, upon which artists would create elaborate scenes. These were not merely decorative, but functional, magical texts and images that would help the deceased navigate the afterlife. The artists used a grid system to ensure proportional accuracy, first sketching in red ochre, then correcting in black, before finally applying the vibrant colors that would guide the deceased through eternity. The Book of the Dead, a guidebook to the afterlife. Among the most important items placed within the tomb was the Book of the Dead. Not a bound volume, as we might imagine today, but a collection of papyrus scrolls containing spells, incantations, and instructions. These texts, evolved from the earlier pyramid texts and coffin texts, were essentially an instruction manual for navigating the dangerous underworld and achieving eternal life. "Without these words, the deceased would be lost," explained Nefertari, a scribe who specialized in copying these sacred texts. "They would not know how to answer the questions posed by the guardians of the gates. They would not know how to transform themselves into different creatures to overcome obstacles. They would not know the words that would allow them to breathe, eat, and drink in the afterlife." The Book of the Dead was personalized for each individual, containing the specific spells deemed most beneficial for that person's journey. The wealthier the deceased, the more comprehensive their collection of spells would be. Some scrolls were incredibly elaborate, with colorful illustrations showing the deceased in various stages of their afterlife journey, particularly the crucial weighing of the heart ceremony in the Hall of Two Truths. One of the most important spells in the Book of the Dead was the 125th spell, the negative confession, in which the deceased would declare their innocence of various sins before the 42 judges of the dead. Each line began with the phrase, "I have not," followed by transgressions such as, "I have not stolen, I have not killed, and I have not reduced the offering in the temples." "These are not mere assertions," said Pentu, a high priest of Anubis. "These are magical declarations that make something true by their utterance. By declaring one's innocence with the proper ritual words, one becomes innocent." The funerary equipment. Provisions for eternity. The ancient Egyptians believed that the afterlife mirrored life on earth in many ways. The deceased would need to eat, drink, work, and entertain themselves, activities that required proper equipment. Thus, tombs were stocked with everything the deceased might need in their eternal existence. Food offerings were placed in pottery vessels: bread, beer, wine, meat, and vegetables, all magically transformed by ritual into everlasting sustenance. Furniture, beds, chairs, tables, and storage chests was included to ensure comfort. Clothing, jewelry, and cosmetics were provided for proper appearance, as one's presentation before the gods was of paramount importance. For entertainment and leisure, board games like Senet were included, along with musical instruments and hunting equipment. Tools related to the deceased's profession during life were also important inclusions, allowing them to continue their work in the afterlife. "Every object placed within the tomb carries dual significance," observed Kagemni, a priest who had overseen hundreds of burials. "There is the practical purpose, a chair to sit upon, a bed to rest upon, but there is also the symbolic purpose, the magical essence of the object that transcends its physical form." For the highest-ranking individuals, the tomb would also contain shabti figures, small figurines, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, that would magically animate in the afterlife to perform labor on behalf of the deceased. Each shabti was inscribed with a spell that would activate when the deceased was called upon for work in the fields of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. "I am here," the shabti spell proclaimed. "I will do it. Here I am." With these words, the figurine would take the place of the deceased, allowing them to enjoy their eternal existence without the burden of labor. The opening of the mouth ceremony, awakening the senses. As the procession reached the tomb entrance, the most crucial ritual of the funeral began, the opening of the mouth ceremony. This ancient ritual, dating back to the Old Kingdom, was designed to reactivate the senses of the deceased, allowing them to see, hear, breathe, speak, and eat in the afterlife. The mummified body, or more commonly its representation on the outermost coffin, was stood upright before the tomb entrance. A priest wearing a mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, approached with a specialized toolkit containing various instruments: the pesheshkef, a flint knife; the netjeri blade, a metal adze; the sibur, a ram-headed staff; and the urhekau, a serpent-headed wand. With these instruments, the priest would touch the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy or coffin, each contact accompanied by specific recitations. The mouth was of particular importance, as it allowed the deceased to speak the magical spells necessary for survival in the afterlife and to consume the food offerings that would sustain them. "I open for you your mouth," intoned the priest, touching the lips of the coffin with the ceremonial adze. "I split open for you your eyes," he continued, moving the instrument to the painted eyes on the coffin face. The ritual was performed with infinite care, each movement precise, each word pronounced with perfect clarity, for any error might compromise the deceased's chances in the afterlife. As part of this ceremony, a calf would be slaughtered in the presence of the mummy. The still warm foreleg of the animal would be touched to the mouth of the mummy, the life force of the fresh meat symbolically transferring to the deceased. The heart and other organs of the calf might also be presented, each offering accompanied by specific incantations. "Through this leg you shall speak," the priest would declare. "Through this heart you shall feel. Through these eyes you shall see the glory of Ra as he travels across the sky." The final sealing, closing the door to the living world. When all rituals were complete, when every spell had been recited and every offering placed, the time came for the final sealing of the tomb. The mummy, now magically reanimated through ritual, was placed gently in its sarcophagus. The heavy lid was lowered into place with ropes and the strength of many men. For royal burials, this sarcophagus might be nested within several others, each more magnificent than the last, culminating in an enormous granite or quartzite outer sarcophagus weighing several tons. The burial chamber was then secured, often with heavy stone portcullises designed to slide into place, sealing off access. The remaining chambers were exited in reverse order, each doorway ritually purified and sealed. In royal tombs of the New Kingdom, these seals would bear the necropolis seal, an image of Anubis recumbent atop 9 bound captives, representing the enemies of Egypt, who would never disturb the king's eternal rest. As the funeral party reached the entrance of the tomb, the final prayers were offered. The last priest to leave would take a step backward, never turning his back on the sacred space. Then, with a nod to the waiting workers, the entrance would be sealed with stones, mortar, and desert debris, disguising it from potential tomb robbers, though this precaution often proved insufficient over the millennia. "Now you embark upon your journey through the Duat," whispered the high priest, his words meant for the deceased alone. "May Osiris welcome you among the justified. May you sail with Ra in his solar bark. May your name be remembered for all eternity." The eternal cycle, continuing care for the deceased. The sealing of the tomb did not mark the end of the family's obligations to the deceased. In fact, it marked the beginning of a new relationship, one in which the living would continue to care for the dead through offerings and remembrance. For common Egyptians, this might mean simple offerings placed at a small shrine near the burial site. For the elite, it meant the establishment of a mortuary cult with priests dedicated to making daily offerings. These mortuary priests would visit the offering chapel, a separate chamber accessible from outside the sealed tomb, bringing food, drink, and incense. They would recite prayers and perform rituals designed to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. The walls of these chapels were often decorated with scenes of offering processions, magically ensuring that even if the physical offerings ceased, the images would continue to provide nourishment. For pharaohs, these mortuary cults could be enormous institutions with vast landholdings dedicated to providing perpetual offerings. Hundreds of priests might be employed, their sole duty being to maintain the king's eternal existence through daily ritual. These cults could persist for generations, sometimes centuries, though few survived beyond the collapse of the civilization that created them. "To speak the name of the dead is to make them live again," said Mereruka, an elderly priest who had spent his life serving the mortuary cult of a long-dead pharaoh. "Each time we say their name, each time we pour water or burn incense, we reaffirm their existence in the field of reeds." This continuation of care created a bond between the living and the dead, a relationship of mutual benefit. The dead, properly maintained through offering and ritual, would intercede with the gods on behalf of their living families. They would protect their descendants from harm and ensure their prosperity. In return, the living would ensure the dead had everything they needed for a comfortable existence in the afterlife. The democratization of the afterlife, evolution over millennia. In the earliest periods of Egyptian history, only the pharaoh was believed to have an afterlife. The king alone would ascend to join the gods, while his subjects ceased to exist. Over time, this exclusivity eroded, first extending to the royal family, then to nobles, and eventually to anyone who could afford the necessary preparations. By the New Kingdom period, circa 1550-1070 BCE, the afterlife had been democratized to the extent that even ordinary Egyptians believed they could achieve eternal existence, provided they knew the proper spells and could afford at least basic mummification. This shift reflected broader changes in Egyptian society and religious thought, a move toward greater spiritual equality despite the rigid social hierarchies that persisted in life. Once only the king could hope to sail with Re across the sky, reflected Amenemhat, an elderly scribe who had witnessed these changes over his long lifetime. Now, any man or woman who lives according to Ma'at, who knows the spells, who preserves their body, they too may achieve the field of reeds. The gods have become more generous in their judgments. This democratization was reflected in the evolution of funerary texts. The pyramid texts, inscribed exclusively in royal pyramids of the Old Kingdom, gave way to the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, which appeared in the burials of non-royal elites. These in turn evolved into the Book of the Dead, which by the late period could be found in the humblest of tombs, often in abbreviated form, but containing the essential spells for navigating the afterlife. Conclusion: the legacy of Egyptian burial practices, the elaborate tomb preparations, the meticulous mummification process, the comprehensive funerary equipment, the powerful rituals, all these elements combine to create what may be the most sophisticated approach to death ever developed by human civilization. The ancient Egyptians did not fear death. They prepared for it, invested in it, transformed it from an ending into a transition. "Death is not extinguishment," said Imhotep, the legendary sage whose wisdom continued to be quoted thousands of years after his own death. "It is a doorway, a threshold between states of being. With proper preparation, with knowledge of the sacred words, with a body preserved against decay, any Egyptian may achieve what once was reserved for gods, eternal life under the benevolent gaze of Osiris." This perspective on death shaped everything about Egyptian civilization, from its monumental architecture to its religious practices, from its economic systems to its artistic conventions. The resources dedicated to funerary preparations were staggering. Yet the Egyptians considered this investment not a waste, but a necessity, the most important expenditure possible. As the last stones were fitted into place at the tomb entrance, as the final prayers were whispered into the gathering dusk, the deceased began their journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. They would face trials and challenges, confrontations with fearsome guardians and divine judges. Yet with their preserved body resting safely in its tomb, with the Book of the Dead providing guidance, with magical amulets offering protection, and with the ongoing support of mortuary offerings, they had every reason to be confident. The physical tomb, hidden in the desert sands or carved into the living rock, was more than a repository for the dead. It was a launch point for an extraordinary journey, one that would culminate, if all went well, in the deceased being declared true of voice and welcomed into the company of the gods, there to dwell in perfect happiness for all eternity. And so, as the funeral party departed, as the desert winds began to erase their footprints from the sand, the deceased was not left abandoned, but embarked upon the greatest adventure of all, the journey to eternal life in the field of reeds, where the wheat grows taller than men, where the air is always sweet, and where death itself has been conquered through the gentle art of mummification and the power of undying belief. Chapter 10. What the Science Says Today. Modern Revelations of Ancient Practices. In the quiet laboratory of the Cairo Museum's Conservation Department, Dr. Fatima Hassan carefully adjusted her microscope. Under its lens lay a tiny fragment of resinous material, no larger than a grain of rice taken from the wrappings of a 3,000-year-old mummy. As she fine-tuned the focus, the complex molecular structure came into view, a chemical signature that would have been impossible to detect even 50 years ago. "It's extraordinary," she whispered to her colleague. "This particular combination of pistachio resin and cedar oil, preserved for 3 millennia. And look at these compounds, antimicrobial properties that we're only beginning to understand today." Across the world in laboratories from Boston to Tokyo, similar scenes unfold daily as modern science continues to unlock the secrets of ancient Egyptian mummification. Using technologies that would seem as magical to the ancient embalmers as their practices once seemed to us, today's researchers are discovering that these ancient preservation techniques were far more sophisticated, effective, and scientifically sound than previously imagined. The mummies that have survived millennia, some in remarkable states of preservation, stand as testament to the extraordinary achievement of ancient Egyptian embalmers. But only in recent decades, with the advent of non-invasive scanning technologies, advanced chemical analysis, and molecular biology, have we begun to truly understand the scientific principles behind this remarkable funerary technology. Peering inside without disturbing the dead. For nearly 2 centuries after Napoleon's expedition to Egypt sparked a wave of Egyptomania in Europe, examining mummies typically meant unwrapping them, a destructive process that often damaged the very subjects scholars sought to study. Public unwrappings became popular spectacles in Victorian Europe, with mummies destroyed for entertainment under the guise of scientific inquiry. Today's approach could not be more different. Modern researchers adhere to the ethical principle of minimal intervention, using advanced imaging techniques to study mummies without disturbing their wrappings. The CT scanner has revolutionized mummy studies, explained Dr. Jonathan Reynolds, a paleoradiologist who has examined hundreds of mummies using computed tomography. We can now create detailed three-dimensional models of the body inside the wrappings, examine bone structure, identify pathologies, even see the individual layers of linen bandages, all without removing a single wrap. CT scanning, computed tomography, passes X-rays through the mummy from multiple angles, creating cross-sectional images that can be assembled into detailed 3D models. This technology has revealed extraordinary details: dental work performed during life, evidence of diseases like tuberculosis and arteriosclerosis, signs of trauma and their treatment, and even details of the embalming process itself. We can see where embalmers made incisions, identify packing materials inside body cavities, locate amulets placed between bandage layers, and examine the resin applications on the skin, Reynolds explained. We're essentially watching over the embalmer's shoulders as they worked, observing techniques that varied by era, region, and social status of the deceased. More recently, advanced spectroscopic techniques have allowed researchers to analyze the chemical composition of mummification materials without extracting samples. Portable X-ray fluorescence devices can be brought to museum collections, identifying elements present in resins and pigments without touching the mummy itself. Raman spectroscopy uses laser light to identify molecular structures without sample collection. These non-destructive techniques reveal not just what materials were used, but how they interacted over time, noted Dr. Eliza Montague, a conservation scientist specializing in ancient organic materials. We're finding that some chemical reactions are still ongoing after thousands of years, slow-motion chemistry that contributes to the mummy's remarkable preservation. The antimicrobial arsenal of ancient embalmers. Perhaps the most surprising discovery from modern chemical analysis is the sophisticated understanding of antimicrobial substances demonstrated by ancient Egyptian embalmers. The mixture of resins, oils, and plant extracts used in mummification wasn't chosen merely for religious symbolism or pleasant scent. These substances actively combated the bacteria and fungi that cause decomposition. Dr. Stephen Buckley, an archaeological chemist at the University of York, has been at the forefront of analyzing the precise chemical makeup of mummification materials. His research has identified complex mixtures of plant oils, including cedar, juniper, and pine, plant-based resins such as pistacia and myrrh, plant extracts, including cinnamon and other aromatics, bitumen, natural petroleum, beeswax, and various salts. What's remarkable is that many of these substances have proven antimicrobial properties, Buckley explained. Cedar oil, for instance, contains compounds that are still used in modern antiseptics. Myrrh and frankincense have documented antimicrobial effects. Even the natron salt mixture they use for dehydration creates an environment hostile to most microorganisms. Laboratory tests have confirmed the effectiveness of these ancient formulas. When tested against modern bacterial cultures, extracts from ancient mummy resins have shown significant antibacterial activity, even after 3,000 years. This suggests that the embalmers, through generations of observation and refinement, developed highly effective preservation compounds without understanding the germ theory of disease that would only emerge in the 19th century CE. They were essentially practicing antimicrobial chemistry without knowing it, marveled Dr. Hassan. Their understanding was framed in religious and magical terms, preparing the body for eternity, but the practical effectiveness of their methods relied on solid chemical principles that we're only now fully appreciating. The use of natron for dehydration represents another example of scientifically sound practice. This naturally occurring mixture of sodium compounds, primarily sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, not only desiccated the body thoroughly, but also created an alkaline environment that inhibited bacterial growth. The 40-day period specified for this dehydration process turns out to be nearly optimal for the climate conditions of ancient Egypt. If the body had been removed too early, moisture would remain in deeper tissues, promoting decay, explained Dr. Michael Zimmerman, a paleopathologist who has studied the preservation of ancient tissues. Much longer and the extreme desiccation might have made the body too brittle for the wrapping process. Their 40-day time frame shows remarkable empirical understanding of the process. Genetic information preserved across millennia. One of the most extraordinary scientific revelations of recent decades has been the successful extraction and analysis of ancient DNA from Egyptian mummies. Despite the hot climate of Egypt, conditions generally unfavorable for DNA preservation, researchers have recovered genetic material from numerous mummies, opening new windows into ancient Egyptian biology, disease, and population relationships. When I began my career, the idea of sequencing DNA from ancient Egyptian mummies was considered virtually impossible, recalled Dr. Johannes Schmidt, a pioneer in ancient DNA analysis. The combination of heat, millennia of time, and the chemicals used in mummification was thought to have destroyed any recoverable genetic material. We now know that's not entirely true. While DNA preservation in Egyptian mummies is indeed challenging compared to remains from cooler climates, advances in extraction techniques and next-generation sequencing technology have made it possible to recover fragmentary but informative genetic data. This has allowed researchers to investigate everything from the genetic diseases affecting ancient Egyptians to their biological relationships with other Mediterranean and African populations. In 2017, an international team successfully conducted the first reliable genetic study of ancient Egyptians, analyzing mitochondrial and nuclear DNA from 151 mummies dating from approximately 1400 BCE to 400 CE. Their findings suggested genetic continuity with ancient Near Eastern populations and revealed that ancient Egyptians shared more ancestry with Near Easterners than modern Egyptians, who have received more genetic input from sub-Saharan Africa in the past 1,500 years. The genetic analysis allows us to test theories about ancient Egyptian population movements that were previously based solely on archaeological evidence or historical texts, explained Dr. Sarah Matheson, who specializes in ancient population genetics. It also lets us examine royal lineages, test claim family relationships within elite tombs, and potentially identify the presence of foreign individuals within Egyptian society. Beyond population studies, DNA analysis has revealed specific diseases that afflicted ancient Egyptians. Genetic markers for tuberculosis, malaria, and schistosomiasis have been identified in mummified remains, confirming what had previously been suspected from paleopathological examination of tissues. Researchers have even detected evidence of genetic disorders, such as cases of Marfan syndrome in some royal mummies. The preservation of genetic material speaks to the extraordinary effectiveness of their mummification techniques, noted Schmidt. These ancient practitioners couldn't have known they were preserving DNA, a molecule whose existence wouldn't be discovered until the 1950s. Yet their methods sometimes succeeded in preserving this most fragile biological information. Chemical discoveries that change history. The effectiveness of ancient Egyptian embalming materials has occasionally had far-reaching consequences beyond archaeology. In the early 20th century, analysis of the preservative substances used in mummification led directly to medical and industrial innovations that have saved countless lives. Many people don't realize that modern surgical sutures have a connection to ancient Egyptian embalming practices, explained Dr. Richard Hamilton, a medical historian. When early researchers analyzed the resins used in mummification, they identified compounds with powerful antiseptic properties. This inspired the development of phenol-based surgical applications, including treated sutures that reduced post-surgical infections dramatically. Another unexpected connection emerged during World War I, when the British military studied mummy wrappings to understand how they had resisted decay for thousands of years. This research contributed to the development of improved bandages for wounded soldiers, incorporating antimicrobial compounds inspired by ancient Egyptian formulations. Even the beauty industry has been influenced by these ancient practices. Analysis of the cosmetics found in Egyptian tombs, often intended for the deceased's use in the afterlife, revealed lead-based compounds that paradoxically helped prevent eye infections, a serious health concern in the dusty environment of ancient Egypt. What they understood intuitively through observation and religious practice, We now understand through chemistry and microbiology, said Dr. Catherine Peters, who studies ancient cosmetic formulations. The kohl eyeliner they used, for instance, was not merely decorative. The lead salts it contained created an environment hostile to bacteria, actually reducing eye infections in a pre-antibiotic era. The mystery of the brain removal technique. Despite all these advances in our understanding, some aspects of mummification remain mysterious. Perhaps none has generated more scientific debate than the technique used to remove the brain prior to embalming. Ancient texts and physical evidence make clear that the brain was extracted through the nasal passage, typically using a hook-like instrument inserted through the ethmoid bone, the thin bone that separates the nasal cavity from the brain. But the precise methodology has been difficult to determine, as the procedure left minimal traces and no detailed descriptions survive from antiquity. "It's an extraordinary technical achievement when you think about it," marveled Dr. Adams, a neurosurgeon who has studied ancient trepanation and brain surgery. They were removing an entire brain through a nasal opening, roughly the diameter of a pencil, working essentially blind, without damaging the facial bones or external appearance of the deceased. CT scans of intact mummies have provided new insights into this procedure. In many cases, the ethmoid bone shows clear signs of having been broken through, creating a passage approximately 2 cm in diameter. Traces of broken sphenoid bones are sometimes visible as well. Remarkably, the brain was not always completely removed. In some mummies, portions of brain tissue remain in the cranial cavity, particularly in the posterior regions farthest from the nasal access point. The variation we see suggests this was a specialized skill with differing levels of expertise among practitioners, noted Dr. Sophia Rossi, who has cataloged brain removal techniques across hundreds of CT scan mummies. Some show clean extraction with minimal damage to surrounding structures, while others exhibit multiple attempts, fractured nasal turbinates, or incomplete removal. Experimental archaeology has provided additional insights. Using modern anatomical models and replicas of ancient tools, researchers have attempted to recreate the brain extraction procedure, discovering that it requires not only specialized instruments, but considerable anatomical knowledge and practice technique. The embalmers needed to understand precisely where to pierce the ethmoid bone to access the cranial cavity, explained Dr. Robert Jennings, who has conducted such experiments. Too high and they would miss the brain entirely. Too low and they would damage facial structures. Too far to either side and they would cause bleeding that would complicate the procedure. These experiments suggest that successful brain removal likely involved liquefying the brain tissue before extraction, perhaps by stirring the brain matter with hooks or introducing chemical substances to break down the tissue. The semi-liquid matter could then be drained by positioning the body with the head tilted downward, allowing gravity to assist in the process. It's a procedure that required intimate knowledge of human anatomy, specialized tools, and considerable practice, Jennings concluded. This specialist knowledge was likely closely guarded within the embalming profession and passed down through generations of practitioners. Climate change and the threat to ancient remains. As researchers race to unlock the remaining secrets of ancient Egyptian mummification, a new threat looms over these remarkably preserved remains. Climate change. Rising temperatures, changing humidity patterns, and increasingly extreme weather events pose serious conservation challenges for mummies both in museums and in their original tomb contexts. Mummies survived for thousands of years in the stable, arid environment of Egyptian tombs, explained Dr. Elena Vargas, a conservation specialist focusing on organic materials. Now that stability is being disrupted, we're seeing increased moisture levels in tombs that remain dry for millennia, creating conditions that can reactivate dormant microorganisms or promote new types of decay. Even mummies housed in climate-controlled museum environments face risks. Power outages during extreme weather events can expose collections to rapid temperature and humidity fluctuations. Museums in coastal areas face increased flooding risks that could devastate collections. The carbon footprint of maintaining strict climate control in exhibition spaces continues to grow, creating an ethical dilemma for institutions committed to both preservation and environmental responsibility. We're developing new conservation protocols in response to these challenges, noted Dr. Marco Samadelli, who specializes in mummy conservation. This includes creating microenvironments within display cases that can maintain stable conditions even during broader climate control failures, using passive humidity control materials, and developing emergency response plans specifically for organic human remains. Modern scanning technology is being deployed to monitor mummies for early signs of deterioration. Regular CT scans can detect subtle changes in tissue density or bandage integrity that might indicate ongoing decay processes. Surface scanning techniques can identify microscopic changes in coloration or texture that might signal conservation issues requiring intervention. In a way, we're becoming modern embalmers ourselves, reflected Samadeli. Like our ancient counterparts, we're developing techniques to extend the preservation of these remains, though our time frame is millennia, rather than the days or weeks the original embalmers worked within. The ethics of mummy research. As scientific techniques for studying mummies have advanced, so too have the ethical frameworks governing this research. Modern scholars face complex questions about the appropriate treatment of human remains, cultural heritage rights, religious respect, and the limits of scientific inquiry. When I began my career, it was still common to unwrap mummies for study or extract tissue samples without much ethical oversight. Recall Dr. Elizabeth Marlowe, who has worked in Egyptology for over 4 decades. Today, any research proposal involving human remains undergoes rigorous ethical review, considering not just scientific merit, but cultural and religious perspectives as well. Many museums have developed specialized protocols for mummy research, requiring clear scientific justification for any sampling and mandating that studies use the least invasive techniques possible. Research that can be conducted non-invasively using imaging or surface analysis is preferred over methods requiring physical samples. We always ask ourselves, is this research question important enough to justify physical intervention with these human remains? Explained Dr. Richard Wilkinson, Ethics Committee Chair at a major archaeological museum. And could the same information be obtained through non-destructive means, even if that approach might be more costly or time-consuming? Egyptian authorities have become increasingly involved in decisions about research conducted on mummies, both those housed in Egypt and in foreign collections. This reflects growing recognition of source countries' cultural rights and the importance of including descendant communities in research decisions, even when separated by thousands of years. Some of the most ethically complex cases involve royal mummies, particularly those of famous pharaohs like Tutankhamun, Ramesses II, or Hatshepsut. These individuals constructed elaborate tombs and undertook extensive mummification specifically to ensure their bodily integrity for eternity. Religious beliefs that can seem at odds with scientific curiosity about their lives, health, and deaths. We try to balance scientific knowledge with respect, said Dr. Ahmed Barakat of the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. These were real people who never consented to become museum exhibits or research subjects. Yet their remains contain invaluable information about our shared human past. There are no simple answers to these dilemmas. The secret still held. Despite centuries of study and remarkable recent advances, significant aspects of ancient Egyptian mummification remain mysterious. Some of these gaps in knowledge stem from the secretive nature of the embalming profession itself, which deliberately kept certain techniques hidden from outsiders. The embalmers were sworn to secrecy, explained Dr. Hassan. They worked in closed workshops, passed their knowledge orally to carefully selected apprentices, and left almost no written records of their specific techniques. What we know comes primarily from archaeological evidence and the accounts of outsiders like Herodotus, who may have been shown only what the embalmers wanted them to see. Among the most significant remaining mysteries is the exact composition of the resinous substances used in the final stages of mummification. While chemical analysis has identified many components, the precise recipes, including proportions, preparation methods, and application techniques, remain elusive. Evidence suggests these formulations varied by time period, region, and the status of the deceased, with the most effective combinations perhaps reserved for royalty and high elites. We've identified over 100 different chemical compounds in mummification resins, noted Dr. Buckley, but knowing the ingredients is not the same as understanding the recipe. How were these substances prepared? Were they heated to specific temperatures, combined in particular sequences, applied with specific tools or techniques? These practical details may never be fully recovered. Another persistent mystery involves the psychological and religious experience of the embalmers themselves. The mummification workshop was a liminal space between life and death, where practitioners performed complex procedures on human remains while reciting religious texts and observing sacred rituals. The mental framework that allowed these specialists to perform their technical work within a deeply religious context offers fascinating insights into ancient consciousness. These weren't simply technicians applying preservatives, explained Dr. Margaret Wilson, who studies ancient religious practices. They were priests engaged in a transformative ritual, converting a deceased human into an eternal, divine being. They likely experienced their work as a sacred calling, not merely a profession. Some researchers speculate that certain mummification knowledge may have been deliberately taken to the grave. Master embalmers might have kept their most effective techniques secret even from their own apprentices, revealing them only to chosen successors. If true, this would mean some of the most sophisticated preservation methods may have been lost when particular lineages of embalmers died out, or when Egyptian religious practices changed under Greek, Roman, and later Christian influences. Modern applications of ancient wisdom. The scientific study of mummification has yielded unexpected benefits for modern medicine, forensic science, and conservation technology. Techniques developed to preserve and study ancient human remains have found applications in fields far removed from archaeology and Egyptology. The preservative compounds we've identified in mummy resins have inspired new approaches to tissue preservation for medical research, explained Dr. Thomas Green, who bridges archaeological chemistry and medical research. These natural substances sometimes outperform modern synthetic preservatives, particularly for long-term storage of biological samples. Forensic scientists have applied knowledge gained from studying ancient mummification to better understand decomposition processes in modern contexts. The study of how ancient tissues respond to specific environmental conditions has helped refine techniques for determining time of death and reconstructing postmortem events in criminal investigations. Perhaps most surprisingly, conservation scientists working to preserve modern organic materials, from historical documents to natural history specimens, have found inspiration in ancient Egyptian techniques. The stable chemical properties of mummification resins have influenced the development of new conservation treatments for deteriorating artifacts, while the study of ancient wrapping methods has informed techniques for supporting fragile objects. It's humbling to realize that these ancient practitioners, working more than 3,000 years ago, without modern scientific understanding, developed preservation methods that we're still learning from today, reflected Dr. Green. Their empirical knowledge, refined over centuries of careful observation and practice, sometimes anticipated discoveries we like to think of as modern. Some researchers have even proposed that certain aspects of mummification chemistry might hold clues to addressing contemporary challenges in sustainability and green chemistry. The plant-based preservatives used by ancient embalmers were remarkably effective yet biodegradable, qualities increasingly valued in an age concerned with reducing synthetic chemical use. The ancient Egyptians developed a sophisticated technological system using entirely natural, renewable materials, noted Dr. Catherine Peters. Their preservatives came from plant resins, their wrappings from linen, their antimicrobial agents from essential oils. There's something powerful in that approach that modern chemistry is only now beginning to appreciate. Replicating ancient techniques. Modern experimental mummification. Perhaps the most direct way modern scientists have sought to understand ancient mummification has been through experimental replication, applying documented ancient techniques to modern biological specimens, or, in rare cases, to donated human remains. Dr. Bob Breyer, an Egyptologist, sometimes called Mr. Mummy for his extensive work with ancient remains, conducted the first modern mummification of a human body using ancient Egyptian techniques in 1994. Working with an anatomist and using a donated body, Breyer meticulously followed procedures described by Herodotus and other ancient sources, supplemented by archaeological evidence. Reading about mummification is one thing, actually doing it is entirely different, Breyer later wrote of the experience. We encountered numerous practical challenges that aren't mentioned in ancient texts, but must have been common knowledge to Egyptian embalmers: how to position the body during evisceration, how to extract the brain without damaging facial features, how to prevent bandages from unwinding during the wrapping process. More recently, researchers have conducted smaller-scale experiments using animal remains or individual human organs donated for scientific research. These controlled studies allow for precise measurement of preservation effects under different conditions, testing hypotheses about specific embalming materials or techniques. Dr. Stephen Buckley and Dr. Joe Fletcher of the University of York have pioneered such experimental work, systematically testing the preservative properties of different natron formulations, resin combinations, and wrapping techniques. Their research has demonstrated that the precise composition of natron used significantly affects preservation outcomes, with some formulations producing far better results than others. The ancient embalmers were not working by rote formula, explained Dr. Fletcher. They were sophisticated practitioners who adjusted their techniques based on environmental conditions, the condition of the body, and the specific requirements of each case. What we're finding through experimental work is that this adaptability was crucial to their success. These experiments have also highlighted the extraordinary skill level of ancient practitioners. Modern researchers, despite advantages of scientific knowledge and precision equipment, often achieve less impressive preservation results than their ancient counterparts. There's an element of virtuosity in the ancient work that's difficult to replicate, admitted Dr. Buckley. These were specialists who had performed these procedures hundreds or thousands of times, who understood intuitively how different body types responded to preservation techniques, who could adjust their methods based on subtle cues we're still learning to recognize. Conclusion: a legacy of preservation. As the afternoon sun slanted through the laboratory windows, Dr. Hassan carefully returned the tiny fragment of mummy resin to its protective container. 3,000 years after an ancient embalmer applied this substance to preserve a body for eternity, it continued to yield new scientific insights through analytical techniques its creators could never have imagined. What strikes me most, she reflected, is not just the technical achievement of preservation, impressive though that is, but the profound human motivation behind it. These elaborate techniques, refined over centuries, express something fundamental about our relationship with death and our desire for continuity beyond it. The ancient Egyptian approach to death, not as an ending, but as a transition requiring careful preparation, produced one of humanity's most remarkable technological achievements. Through empirical observation, religious dedication, and generational refinement of techniques, they developed a preservation system so effective that it continues to maintain human remains millennia after application, allowing modern researchers direct access to ancient lives. In creating their technology of immortality, they achieved a form of it they never anticipated, observed Dr. Wilson. Not through the magical reunification of Ba and Ka as they believed, but through the scientific and cultural dialogue their preserved bodies continue to generate in our time. The scientific study of mummification reflects a curious circularity. Ancient practitioners preserved bodies based on their understanding of life, death, and eternity, while modern researchers study these preserved remains to better understand those who preserved them. Each generation interprets these ancient human remains through its own cultural and scientific lens, finding new meaning in this remarkable Egyptian legacy. And still, the mummies keep their secrets. Despite advanced imaging, chemical analysis, and experimental replication, aspects of ancient Egyptian embalming practice remain elusive. Techniques perhaps deliberately hidden, specialized knowledge lost when the last practitioners passed away, or subtle aspects of practice that leave no detectable trace after millennia. There is a certain poetry in this, suggested Dr. Hassan, carefully logging her findings before shutting down her microscope for the day. The ancient embalmers sought to defeat time itself, preserving bodies for eternity. In some ways, they succeeded beyond their wildest imaginings, yet time still maintains some of their secrets, preserving mystery alongside remarkable preservation. As she turned off the laboratory lights, a glass case in the corner held the serene, wrapped face of a mummy whose name had been lost to history, one of thousands remaining from ancient Egypt. their preserved bodies standing as testament to a civilization that refused to accept the finality of death, and whose innovative preservation technology continues to engage our scientific curiosity and human imagination 3,000 years after the last embalming workshop closed its doors forever.